Hey there guys, it's Mark here again. Just shooting you another quick warning that one of the films that we're going to be talking about in this episode does feature some pretty unsavoury and upsetting content. So just a pre-warning that when we discuss Alice, Sweet Alice, there are themes of molestation, abuse, child endangerment, a lot of really quite, unpleasant stuff. So this is just a heads up that when we do get to that section, we will be talking about that. Thought it would be best to let you know. And yeah, enjoy the show. That was my cat meowing.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to your favorite movie podcast, Kino, Inferno. I'm one of your hosts, Aiden.
And I'm one of your other hosts. I'm Mark.
And as you can tell by this sensuous introduction, today we're talking about slasher movies, or more appropriately, Proto-Slasher movies. So, Mark.
Jesus Christ, maybe.
What do we mean? What do we mean by Proto-Slasher movies? This theme was your choice.
Yes.
You are the slasher movie boy.
I am a slut for
love
slasher
to take
movies,
a slash. Yes. Yeah, he's always taken a slash all over a big hairy man's chest.
We are 1 minute in. And you've already made references to me shooting my feculence all over men, and honestly I'm living for it. Yes, I chose this subject because like I said, I'm a big old slut for slasher movies. They're one of my favourite genres of movie, hence why I subjected you to all 5 Scream movies recently. It's the reason why I've seen every Friday the 13th movie at least 5 or 6 times a piece, for better or for worse. But there's always been a lot of discussion and debate over the years as to where the slasher movie genre started. I'm going to just be upfront and say, in my opinion, Halloween is the first proper slasher movie, or at least in terms of what we know as the slasher movie. So 1978, John Carpenter, Halloween. That to me is the first true slasher movie.
Yeah, well, that's the one that has the all the tropes that we now associate with the genre.
Exactly.
It has the the final girl and the masked killer and everything. So I think I would agree with that. But there's certainly scholarly debate as to the precursors to Halloween and the precursors to the slasher genre in general. And we are nothing if not studious scholars of cinema.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of movies that predate Halloween that are arguably slasher movies in their own right, or completely inspired. Obviously, giallo cinema is such a huge influence on the slasher genre. There's so many movies in that canon which you could argue are slasher.
And if you don't know what giallo is as a genre, as a thing, as a mood, as a vibe, go back to season 1, episode 2. The new giallo? There was a question.
It was giallo, is what we had to say.
Giallo, yeah. Go check that out. Because it gives us more hits on the website.
It does, and also you might learn something.
Well, probably not.
We try to inform as well as entertain. We are mostly dick and fart jokes, but we do try and at least, enrich people's knowledge of cinema.
Yeah,
but
it's part of our mission statement, which was given to us by the marketing kangaroo. We've been in a lot of meetings since last week.
Yeah, he's a bit thorough, isn't he?
He's a bit too thorough, if anything.
Yeah. But
try and make us go corporate. Oh shit, here he comes now. Boing, 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 boing. Alright, mates. Any chance you could tone down the sort of homoerotic piss play early doors? That's the sort of thing that, I don't know if you know, is a bit of a turn-off for the average listener. Also, just throwing it out there, could you do another one about cats? People like that one. Alright, see you later. Boing, 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 boing. What a cunt. What a cunt.
Something tells me, right, he really likes the cats episode, because he won't stop bringing it up.
Well, it's a very popular episode, Mark, and for good reason. If people want to check that one out, that's season 1, episode...
It's episode 9 or 10?
9. Yeah,
something like that. It was in season 1, goes Lloyd Webber Lunacy, where we talked about... Well, we mostly talked about cats. We touched on the Phantom of the Opera, but we pretty much just talked about... Well, should I more accurately say you talked about cats? And
yeah.
You completely...
And you learned, you listened.
I don't know what was happening to me during that. I just got the biggest, most deranged lecture on the history of cats that I think nobody's had a better lesson on cats than I have, I think. That's what I'd say. But getting back on topic, before you tell me some more things about Skimbleshanks and all the rest of those weird, horny cats, there's definitely quite a few films that predate Halloween that, are definitely helping to shape that genre as it was sort of burgeoning and such. 2 of which, obviously, we're talking about today. I'm also going to shout out Black Christmas, which... could arguably be considered the first slasher movie. But
the 2019 Black Christmas, starring Imogen Poots.
Yes. Big Immy Poots.
That we covered on the Christmas special from last year, Crimbo Inferno. So if people want to hear our opinions on that, then you know where to go, baby.
I just want to point out that Aidan has clearly been taking notes from the marketing kangaroo, because he is all about past promotion right now.
He's got a gun, Mark.
He does have a gun.
He's Australian as well, so he'll use it.
Actual psychopath. So the movie...
Like all Australians.
I was thinking it, I didn't want to say it. I'm glad you said it, because now I won't get sued by all of Australia.
No, look, we should say, for legal reasons, not all Australians are psychopaths, but they are all criminals. You were saying
that? Yes. And this is how we lose all of our Australian listeners, by which I mean that one crazy bloke who listens to us.
Crazy Steve.
So, for this episode, because, we are going to be talking about Proto-Slashers, there's 2 films that we've decided to talk about. My choice is Alice, Sweet Alice from 1974, and Aidan, your choice was...
Psycho from 1960. I don't know if the listeners have heard of this one. Directed by some guy called Alfred Hitchcock.
I thought his name was Alan Stopcock.
No, that's you're thinking of a different bloke. So I don't know if people have heard of that one. A bit obscure. From 1960, obviously a bit underground. Will it be Kino? Will it be Inferno? Well, let's find out.
I've caused you some trouble.
No, Mother, my mother, what is the phrase? She isn't quite herself today.
You shouldn't have bothered. I really don't have that much of an appetite.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wish you could apologize for other people.
Don't worry about it. But as long as you fixed a supper, we may as well eat it.
Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, adapted from the novel by Robert Bloch, tells the story of Marion Crane, played by Janet Leigh, as she impulsively steals a large sum of money from her employer and goes on the run, being forced by circumstance and inclement weather to take refuge at the Bates Motel, a rundown roadside joint that would certainly earn a negative Yelp review or 2. Run by the twitchy Norman Bates, portrayed in iconic form by Anthony Perkins. As the two converse, it becomes clear that Norman lives in the shadow of his abusive and controlling mother, and is deeply maladjusted despite his initially pleasant demeanour. Marion finds herself murdered for her troubles, leading her sister, her lover, and an ill-fated private detective to investigate the Bates Motel and eventually learn the troubling secrets that Norman is struggling to hide. So, Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch.
Can I just say, kudos to you, because you basically gave us 90% of the plot of Psycho there, which means that we don't have to go
for some reason, I covered up the spoilers. As if anyone doesn't know. People who haven't seen the movie know what the ending of Psycho is, right? But listen, Marky Mark. What is your relationship to Psycho? You've seen it before, I assume.
Oh, I've seen it quite a few times, but before recording this episode, this was the first time I watched it for quite a while, or at least in its entirety. I remember catching some of it on TV not long ago and just sort of having it on for half an hour. But no, I've seen this movie quite a lot. It's a film that my mum likes quite a lot, so I've seen it quite a lot because of her. It means I've also seen the sequels quite a few times as well.
That's interesting, because my mum was a big fan of Bates Motel when that was on.
I've not watched much of that, actually. I used to live with somebody who was really into it, and I caught little snippets of it here and there, and it seemed quite good.
Yeah, I've not seen it. I've only seen bits and bobs when I was staying at my parents', but it looked okay.
It's got Vera Farmiga in it, so it's definitely worth a look in my eyes, because and it's also Freddie Highmore, isn't it, who plays Norman in the series. It went on for 5 seasons, which I was like, that's a lot for this kind of story.
Yeah, especially given that the ending of the series is kind of, it must be the setup to this movie, right?
Yeah, I believe the final season of Bates Motel is the events of Psycho.
Oh, okay.
What I gather. I mean, it's similar to that Obi-Wan TV show that's out at the minute that I don't give a shit about, because
I have not seen it.
Everybody's kind of like, oh my god, it's this Obi-Wan series. I'm like, right, but we already know that Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, like, we know what happens to those characters. Like, so where's the...
like, how much
more
tension? Can you really bring out of it? Yeah.
Yeah, like, how, I'm just like, can we just stop banking off on franchises like this? Anyway, so Psycho, I've seen it quite a few times, and I was really excited to watch it again for this, because it has been a while. And I'm a little bit apprehensive to talk about this movie, purely because what can you really say about Psycho that hasn't already been said? Like, it's one of the most well talked about and well analysed movies ever. So it's kind of hard to just not feel like you're reiterating the sort of spiel that comes about whenever this movie gets brought up.
Well, that is the difficulty we're going to have. But I think what we can sort of do, because like yourself, Mark, I've seen this movie a few times. I wouldn't say I've watched it regularly in my days, but I've certainly, I think the first time I watched it, I was probably GCSE age. So, like 13, 14, 15 or something. And I've seen it a couple of times since then. But not for a while before watching it for the show, like yourself. But yeah, I think what we can do is, because obviously we can go over some of the stuff that people always go over about this movie, but I think what we can do for, and why I kind of picked this for this subject, as I say, a little peek behind the curtain. Ooh, showing a bit of leg. Is that clunge? No, it's closed too quickly.
What's that smell? Is it clunge?
Is that clunge?
Available on a t-shirt soon.
We should start a sister show called Is That Clunge? Anyway,
So like your old game show idea, was it Damp or Moist?
Damp or Moist, yeah. I mean, that speaks for itself, that title. Is it damp or is it moist? Listen, what are we talking about? Psycho.
Yeah, some bloke in women's clothes.
Now, steady on spoilers.
To Psycho.
I'm going to add in like a klaxon sound there for the spoilers. Listen, Mark, what we can do for this episode of the show that we both present, Kino Inferno, is we can talk about what it's like to view this movie through a modern lens.
Yep, I like that.
Because obviously we're talking about how it pertains to slasher movies, right? So, look, we're not going to just go over the same old shit of like, oh, did you know the blood was made out of chocolate sauce because they knew they were making it in black and white and it would show up better? Or, oh, they tricked the censors. They thought that they saw a naked boob in this movie, asked him to edit it out, and he just took it and then didn't do anything with it and sent it back, and that's the movie we have now. There's some interesting stuff with this movie about like censorship and stuff that we can maybe get into down the line. But I guess what I want to ask you is like, what is it like watching this movie through the lens of like all the things it's influenced since? Because obviously you're an aficionado, a connoisseur of the slasher genre. So with that in mind, where do you think Psycho sits today? Because obviously at the time it was a sensation. But how does it sit today for you as a viewer of slashers, as a taker in of knifey stab movies?
So for me, watching this film now, again, looking at it as somebody who's sort of grown up watching slasher movies, it's kind of amazing to see, kind of how low-key this film is for the most part. Like, A lot of people think of Psycho, and again, they do think of the more iconic scenes. They think of the shower scene. They think of Arbogast getting slashed on the stairs. They think about like the reveal of Mother's corpse. But the shocking, lurid moments are really quite few and far between in this film. Like, they do hit really hard when they come about. But yeah, it's a surprisingly low-key movie. It's a very talky movie as well. But like, I'm okay with that because it's very atmospheric. And it really gives like its characters a chance to breathe, and you don't really get that in a lot of like slasher movies because obviously the body count has to be big.
Yeah.
Also, interestingly, 2 people die in this movie. That's it. Like.
Yeah. Well, obviously there's pre-movie deaths that we find out about later on.
Yes, but on screen we only see Marion Crane and Arbogast get killed.
Yeah.
And even then, like the murders are really quite not that graphic. They rely so much on suggestion.
Yeah, well, that's the classic Hitchcockian thing, isn't it? There's a lot more, suggestive content than there is explicit. So, like in the shower scene, it's not that you never see the knife break skin; you very rarely see it.
There's 3 frames, I believe. Only 3 frames that show it, and even then, it's like a lighting trick, I think. Obviously, that shower scene has to be spoken about because not only is it, one of the most iconic and parodied scenes in all of cinema, but it was very much... we've seen it time and time again in slasher movies, particularly, obviously, Scream is the big one, where the most famous person in the movie gets killed relatively early in the film. Obviously, slasher movies get that out of the way much sooner. Like, it's a good 35 to 40 minutes before Janet Leigh gets stabbed to death in the shower in this film. They spend a lot of time with her. And then she just gets really swiftly, brutally murdered.
Yes, they really build up to it, because we should say, I kind of touched on it in the spiel, we spend a lot of time with Janet Leigh's character, Marion, because obviously we see her with her lover, Sam Loomis. Just going to leave a pregnant pause there. Obviously, real ones know what we're referencing there. Or what was referencing this, I should say.
Yep.
So we spend a bit of time with her lover, and we kind of see her situations. He's like dissatisfied with just being a shag piece, basically, and she wants him to, commit, which it's a problem as old as time, ladies, and it's a problem that persists to this day. Men are dogs. What can we say?
It is true. We are the fucking worst.
But I thought that this is actually something that was quite interesting, because this is one of the elements that the film censorship board really kind of cracked down on, was this early scene. Because one of the things that they were absolutely against at this time was unmarried couples being implied or shown to have any sexuality, right? And even married couples, they'd often be shown sleeping in separate beds and things like that. So to have this scene, like, it kind of opens on this, with Marion and Sam like rolling around on the bed, and she's got her, conical bra out.
She's got those Tomb Raider titties going on.
Yeah. It's not like you're seeing the big 3 tits bum fanny, but it's quite suggestive. Like, there's a lot of stuff that kind of, and she's kind of saying to him, "Oh, you need to put your shoes on," and stuff, implying he's been naked. Scandalous, I know.
You hear the pearls being clutched, can't you?
Good Lord.
I know. I mean, of the time, I imagine audiences in 1960 were probably very much shocked by this. Like, it's definitely...
Well, I don't know if audiences were, but certainly the censors at the time used to crack down on this thing kind of quite a lot. I think it's kind of... It's easy to say, like, audiences would have found this shocking, but at the end of the day, audiences go home and fuck their women, you know what I mean? Or they fuck their
That's true. Well, okay, yeah, I think shocking might be the wrong word there, but it probably would have been... I imagine this would have been very exciting when it came about, because,
Yeah, it certainly would have been... It seemed lurid, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think looking at it in the sense of how it helped to shape slasher movies, and again, this is something that's talked about a lot in terms of Psycho, but it really did push the envelope for like what was acceptable on screen. Because you immediately open with Marion and Loomis getting all hot and heavy. I mean, in a slasher movie, they'd be raw dogging. Like, they'd be...
I mean, if this was 1985, we'd be starting with, big bosomed Marion Crane getting ridden rotten on the bed, wouldn't we? And
KFB Marion Crane, known filthy bitch.
KFB, you heard it here first.
KFB, baby.
But no, what we in fact get is this scene, and there is some quite suggestive stuff. Like, she's kind of saying, "Oh, I don't want to keep meeting up in these motels," and he says, "Well, plenty of married couples do that," and this kind of thing. So they're very heavily implying, like, some fucking going down. But yeah, so Marion leaves to go to her work, and this is where she's first tempted by the staggering amount of money that is £40,000.
Well, when you think how much $40,000 would have been back then, like that's
I know, but it's one of those things where it's like,
that's
would you
lottery
really,
money, you know?
would you really go to that? I know.
Imagine how many conical bras she could own.
So many. I mean, we know she's got a white one and a black one. But yeah, so I mean, look, people know the story of Psycho, right? She takes.
Yeah,
the
people
money.
know it, and also, can I say, if you haven't seen Psycho, go and fucking watch Psycho. Like Jesus Christ, it's essential viewing.
Yeah. So, I guess what I want to talk about is like the way the protagonist is kind of set up, especially given the morality codes at the time, is kind of interesting because we have, you know, shock horror, an unwed woman getting raw dogged early doors. Well, we assume raw dogged. We don't know. Sam doesn't seem like a no glove, no love kind of guy to me. He seems a bit devil may care.
I get what you mean. That's the thing. I get it.
Yeah, he's a dirty dog. Because he has that line early on, which I found quite funny, where I'm paraphrasing slightly, where she says, like, "Oh, next time I see you, I want, you know, my sister to be there as a chaperone at my house with a picture of my mother on the wall." And then he goes, "Yeah, no, fine, yeah, we can have dinner, and then we'll send sister off to the movies. We'll turn mother's picture to the wall." So I think Sam knows what he wants, and what he wants is punani.
That's true.
That aside. It's interesting that we're introduced to our female protagonist. So she's an unmarried woman having some sinful sex in a motel. And then literally the next thing we really see her do that's major is nick a load of money from her employer. And pull a sickie, which is also wrong.
Yeah, I mean, of the two, I know which one I think is more deplorable.
Like,
you don't let your work team down. Stealing money from your boss is fine. But that's all good by me.
We've all pulled a sickie, and anyone who pretends they haven't is lying.
We've all pulled a sickie to shag a stranger in a motel and maybe stole some money. Okay, we've all done it.
We've all done it. But yeah, but this is what I think is interesting. So we have this character who's set up in kind of, to be someone who's, you know, a little flawed, to say the least, or certainly by the standards of, society at the time. It's interesting to think about that in terms of how it influences later movies, because typically what starts to kind of come into these kind of slasher movie female protagonists is the sense of purity later on.
Yeah.
And obviously, Janet Leigh's character here, Marion, is not a final girl, but she is our protagonist. She's not a final girl because she gets bumped off.
But she gets the same level of sort of detail and care and character growth that a final girl typically does. I mean, she's kind of the antithesis in terms of her being, a KFB. But
and the interesting thing as well is like she gets killed after she makes the moral decision, because jumping ahead slightly, her conversation with Norman later on, which we'll get into in more detail, at the end of that she's like, "Oh, I should go back and give the money back and try and make amends," and that's when she gets killed. So this movie almost isn't doing the thing that later slasher movies are accused of, which is like, there's almost this puritanical morality of like, oh, if you drink, if you have sex, if you're a woman with boobs, you get killed. In this movie, it's kind of like her morality is kind of irrelevant to her fate almost. Obviously, it's her bad decisions that lead her to be in the Bates Motel in the first place. But when she dies, we're aware of the fact that she was going to go back and make amends. So I just thought that was interesting, especially given...
Yeah, a lot of critics and scholars over the years have talked about what the role of the Bates Motel actually is in terms of Marion's redemption arc, and they talk about the sort of thematic stuff of when she's traveling down the road at night and it's dark and stormy, and the only site of refuge is... There's so much stuff that's applied to that, and I can understand why people go into that. I'm like, no, she just ends up at a crazy person's house. That's kind of it to me. I think there's a lot of thematic stuff, and apparently Hitchcock himself and Janet Leigh as well ascribed quite a lot of meaning to a lot of the events that happen in Bates Motel, which I think is quite interesting. And I like the fact that the two of them had a really good sort of collaborative idea of what Marion's character was, and they really kind of fleshed out the ins and outs of her, which I guess, again, in modern slasher movies, you don't really get that.
Well, you certainly get the sense of that Marion kind of, and this is what she talks about with Norman later on, right? It's like she feels trapped by her life. It feels like she's not going anywhere, which is obviously something she kind of shares with Norman in a twisted way. But to her, obviously, the fact that she's unmarried is an issue. because she's of an age where at that time you would expect to have settled down with a nice fella. And there's the guy who leaves the $40,000 at the at her work. This kind of weird, lecherous guy who comes in and like he's kind of hitting on her. And they actually have the other woman who works with her kind of said, he must not have noticed me because of my wedding ring, sort of thing. So you have this sense of like she's lacking this security in her life in general. Which is obviously probably something that was more relatable to women at the time than it is now, because it is kind of saying like, But then there is that eternally relatable thing of like all the men around her are complete no-hopers, really. Like Sam comes good in the end, but while Marion's alive, he's no use to her, right? Like
pretty much. And the only man who is shown to be in any way kind to her outside of Sam is Norman, who makes her a sandwich, and then
that's twisted.
Ends up being the one that stabs her to death in a shower. So.
Yeah. So he's no good either. Not exactly ideal boyfriend material, running around in his mother's nylons wanking.
Only ever eating sandwiches and candy corn, which is one little sort of character trait of Norman's that I find really interesting.
Yeah, so we'll move on to Norman in a minute. Let's kind of flesh out what we're saying about because I think when we get to Norman, it's all we'll talk about, So let's kind of think about what we're saying with Marion, I guess. So so in your terms, you're the slasher expert. What do you think Marion Crane's influence on the genre is? Because obviously slasher movies are notable for having female protagonists, generally speaking.
I think, I don't know if it's a direct influence, but I think she may have played into this idea in slasher movies that there's always the character who, and I'm using a phrase here that's not a very nice phrase, but there's always kind of like the slut character or the bitch character, the morally dubious female character, as it were.
Yeah.
I think she was definitely influential in that regard. Where
can you give us some hot examples of this character?
Oh, I mean, my favorite bitch in any slasher movie has got to be Judy in Sleepaway Camp. She's just she's iconic. There's Nikki, I believe her name is, from one of the Friday the 13th movies, who she's this vivacious and sort of almost lustfully predatory kind of woman. But no, I think there's plenty of that. And I think, the general final girl is definitely like kind of an antithesis to what Marion Crane is, even though she does get this kind of redemption idea where she is going to give the money back and stuff. I think, a character that would be the complete opposite is Laurie Strode. Somebody who's never had sex and would, she babysits every hour that God sends, to earn money the honest way. Whereas Marion Crane's like, give me dick, give me money, let's do this. Laurie Strode
is kind of a hot mess.
Whereas like Laurie Strode is, the prim and proper innocent young woman who the only reason that she survives Halloween, and this is something that a lot of scholars have attributed to Halloween, saying it's a misogynistic movie because it's the female characters that are sexually active that get murdered.
That's a common complaint about slasher movies, right?
Yeah, and I think in the case of Halloween, the only reason people ascribe that to it is because, Annie and Linda are both, they're planning on getting laid with their boyfriends that night, but it's just more a case of like, I don't think they're killed because they're sexually active. They're just killed because they're more focused on their boyfriends than actually like paying attention to what's going on around them. The only reason why Laurie survives is because she's actually, vigilant, and when her she's getting weird phone calls from her friends, she's actually like, hang on a minute, something isn't right here. Whereas the other two are just like, I want to get fucked. That's kind of it. I don't think the movie is in any way, I don't think those characters are intended to be read in any way as like misogynistic or anything. I think it's just a case of Laurie's actually being vigilant. And there's a whole thing in this as well where like Marion is, considering the actions that she goes through, she's always quite defensive and quite, even when like she's having like an in-depth discussion with Norman, she's still very much kind of in control of it throughout it. And she shuts it down when she wants to shut it down as well. That's the thing. And then the one moment where she's actually murdered is in the shower, where she's at her most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I quite like that as an idea as well. And I think that's why that shower scene's so iconic.
We have an interesting parallel between Norman and Marion in the sense that both of them, when other people speak of them, they speak of them as like these kind of, Marion, she's this trustworthy gal, blah, 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 blah. And, no one seems to know what's going on in her life. And it's kind of the same with Norman when you meet some characters later on who sort of knew him growing up. They talk about him as if he's this meek little thing, which in some ways he is, but obviously there's that, with both of them, there's this other stuff going on. And I almost think there's this commentary in this movie, which is maybe a little absent from other slasher movies, I suppose, which focus more on the titillation and the kind of like, the grandiose scares, so to speak. I think what helps this movie is that the characters feel very well realized, or at least those two definitely do. And you have this idea of like, the face that society sees versus the face, the actual person. And in that conversation scene where Norman and Marion first meet, you do get this weird sense of almost connection between the two of them. Like they're talking around things, obviously, because she's talking around the fact that she's just stolen all this money, and he's talking around the fact that he dresses up in his mother's nylons and wanks every night. But Slash did some murders.
And obviously she's kind of talking around the fact that she's stolen this money and, is an adulterer, I guess.
Yes.
But this is the thing, and I think that's mostly exemplified by the fact that Norman he's genuinely upset that Marion has been killed. That's the thing. Like, when he first finds her body, he's, genuinely quite disturbed by what's happened. He still cleans it up immediately to, protect Mother, because, he's a good little mummy's boy. But, yeah, he's distraught that she's dead.
Yeah. And I think it's this thing as well of, like, there's this kind of thing running through the movie of, like, Marion's relationship to kind of men who come and go. Obviously, we have Sam, who's her lover, but he won't commit, kind of thing.
Yeah,
he only wants the nookie. He only wants the nookie, it seems. And we have obviously her boss, who's this kind of, kind of fatherly, grandfatherly figure to her, and he has this attitude towards her, like, she's a decent gal, a sweetheart, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But then we have this guy who the boss is doing the deal with, who comes in, this cowboy hat wearing motherfucker, he's just, he's like relentlessly hitting on her, basically. Or as much as you could get away with in a film from 1960, right? He's basically kind of being like, boy, I'd sure like to slap that ass.
It's pretty much on that level, really, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and he's throwing his big wad of money around so that everyone can see it. So there's that kind of thing, this kind of crass guy that she kind of has this dynamic with briefly. And obviously I think like the fact he's so crass with her almost is part of what influenced her to steal the money in the first place.
Yeah.
It's this kind of thing of like, oh, well, if you're the kind of person who takes advantage of women that way, like, why shouldn't I take advantage of you? It's kind of an impression I get. Obviously, a lot of this is done through implication.
Yep.
Because we don't actually really see what leads her to take the money. We just see her kind of looking at it, contemplating it, and then taking it.
Yeah.
Obviously, we can imply that we can infer that she's an unwed woman at this point. Is getting a little too old for that racket by 1960s standards anyway. So it's maybe thinking like, well, no man's going to look after me. I've got to look after myself, sort of thing.
Well, the only man in the movie that she actually meets who is shown to be in any way not have any kind of commitment issue and be respectful of women, or at least you'd be led to believe so, is Norman, really. Like, he's very much devoted to his mother, and, he very much respects women. Apart from when he kills them in showers and stuff.
Well, sure.
Yeah.
Because there's also the interaction with Marion and the police officer, which is something that I did want to flag up before we move on from her, which is very interesting.
It is. And also, I want to say, from a filmmaking perspective, you can see where John Carpenter got a lot of the shots from Halloween from, because that police officer is framed in a lot of the ways that Michael Myers is, especially when Marion's in the car and it keeps cutting between that and him stood there staring at her and stuff. You can definitely see that kind of thing.
So just to kind of set the scene, Marion, when she first is on the lam, falls asleep. Well, she sleeps in the car and is awoken by a police officer the next day, and they have a terse exchange of words. The copper just seems to be just kind of checking up on her, making sure she's okay. Kind of says like, you can't sleep here, you need to go somewhere to sleep, sort of thing. Obviously she's thinking about the money that she's got in the car and stuff. It's a really well directed scene, because obviously, as you say, you kind of go from these kind of wide shots and stuff that John Carpenter was definitely borrowing from in several of his movies, to these close-ups as the exchange gets tenser and tenser as you're cutting from Janet to the copper. and he's got these like big fucking like aviator sunglasses on. It's kind of masking his eyes. And nothing particularly tense is being said, but it's like she's constantly trying to get out of the conversation. He's constantly trying to drag her back into it.
Yeah, to the police officer's viewpoint, I mean, I suppose at that time, a single woman sleeping in a car by the roadside would probably seem suspicious. Like,
Yeah, well,
he would definitely assume something untoward had either happened to her or she was doing something untoward.
Yeah, I mean, it's vagrancy if nothing else. But yeah, so that's that. I mean, obviously Marion gets bumped off about 30 minutes into the movie.
Yeah, about 30-40 minutes roughly. Because and that's the thing, and it's sudden. I mentioned this to you off mic as well. Like, I in my head remember the shower scene being so much longer than it is, but it really isn't. She gets in that shower, and then about a minute later, he's stabbing her to death. Like, it's much quicker than I thought it was. I remember it being really drawn
I
out.
remember there being more of her in the shower before the knifing occurs, certainly. And we should say to audiences at the time, this was a big shock reveal because Janet Leigh had been promoted as the star of this movie. This is part of the reason why Hitchcock had his famous no late admissions, because he felt that for this film, which was unusual at the time, but he felt the audiences who came in late and didn't see Janet Leigh would feel cheated, basically. But yeah, so this is kind of like one of the most iconic reversals of expectations in film history, really. Like, you set up this protagonist, and you spend a lot of time with her as well. That's the other thing. Because kind of in my head, I remembered her being in it for like 10 minutes, and then it's the investigation.
Yeah, no, but she's, she is the star, essentially, until she gets bumped off.
Yeah. So at this point, we should probably segue into Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates. Possibly one of the most iconic characters in film history, certainly one of the most iconic villains.
Absolutely, and watching this again, it's amazing to seeing the little details in Norman. Like I mentioned, the candy corn before and stuff. Like a lot is done to sort of frame him in a more childlike manner. Like whenever he talks about, a mother's the boy's best friend, and he has hobbies like taxidermy and stuff, and he's always just seen eating candy. He's got a very strange energy to him.
Yeah, he's very boyish.
And Perkins plays it to perfection as well.
Yeah, and this is something that I wanted to bring up, actually, because this is something I haven't really heard discussed, but kind of came up as I was doing a little digging around the movie. Perkins was bisexual at a time when that was very much not the done thing, and there were rumours about his sexuality for his entire life. He was, he had marriages and kids and stuff, but like he went through conversion therapy, I found out, and which left him in very ill health later on in his life. But something that kind of seems to be a recurrent theme from a lot of people who knew him is that in real life, he kind of had this affected, meek persona that he would kind of play up. And there are lots of accounts of people saying like, oh, that was just, he was always performing initially to seem straight in some respects, but also when people knew more about him, like, his sexuality was perhaps less hetero than he liked to project. There's a quote from someone, I forget who, I've not got it in front of me, who kind of said like, you only saw what Tony wanted you to see. And the rest was hidden. That was how he lived his life.
Very much Norman Bates, really, isn't it? Which
I bring it up because I think it informs this character.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, I've heard similar-ish accounts. I also just want to shout out Anthony Perkins as well, because he is a tremendous actor. I've seen him in a few other films as well. Obviously, most people just know him for Psycho. But one film of his that I quite like, have you ever seen Crimes of Passion with him and Kathleen Turner? Where he plays that, like...
You're talking to the one person who is... It's a certainty that I've seen.
Yeah, I figured you might have. Where Kathleen Turner plays a hooker and Anthony Perkins plays a preacher who's addicted to poppers, who wants to murder her with a dildo. And he's great in that film. Like, he's so good at that. I love him at that.
Ken Russell picture.
Ken Russell picture. A smutty Ken Russell picture. Big fan of Crimes of Passion.
But yeah, just winding back to Perkins, because one thing that I also did hit upon my research which certainly informs this character. And I'm not one of these people who wants to be like, oh, the actor's real life kind of bleeds into the character, man. But in this instance, I definitely think it does. Perkins blamed his what he saw as sexual perversions, or certainly partially blamed it on his overbearing, abusive mother. So this part certainly meant a lot to him, it would seem. How much of that Hitchcock was aware of, I'm not entirely clear. But this is something that Perkins himself spoke about fairly openly in interviews and in his autobiography and things. So it's possible he knew that going in. Certainly Hitchcock had Perkins down as his choice for this role, partially because he seemed, in his words, kind of sympathetic and boyish, which is what we've touched on. So that kind of sad, harrowing story of a man's life aside, I think he's incredible in this movie. And like watching every time I've seen it, that's the thing that stands out to me the most. I mean, the direction's very crisp and slick for the time as well. Obviously, Janet Leigh's great. The supporting cast, acquit themselves well. But I think the thing that really makes this movie stick in the mind is Norman Bates. And I think it's that thing of...
Yeah.
The movies that it inspires, that this kind of becomes the codifier of slasher movies. A lot of them have these memorable killers, right? They have, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, all this kind of thing. But I think this is really one of the only films of that nature where you can look at the killer and go, like, that's the character. Because as much as Marion Crane is the protagonist, Norman kind of really is our second protagonist in this movie.
Like Marion is very much the lead until Norman offs her, and then he becomes the lead of the movie. Because this is just one little thing I will say, is that I do think that the introduction of Marion's sister and Sam Loomis teaming up, they are nowhere near as interesting characters comparatively. Whereas, Arbogast is good for his little brief stint, but this is the thing, like, as soon as Janet Leigh's gone, like, this movie is all about Perkins. It's his movie.
Yeah,
and
I think Hitchcock knows that as well. Like,
yeah,
we're with Norman more than we're with the other characters. So we should say that, the end of the shower scene, we get the scene of Norman coming in, realizing that Marion's been murdered. We think at this point, unless we were born after the year 1960, we think at this point that Norman's mother has done the deed, and Norman is covering for her, which we kind of find out is sort of true later on.
Yeah, to a degree.
To a point. There's a very long monologue from a psychologist to that effect.
I'm not a fan of that scene, but...
We'll fucking get to that guy. But, we get this very long, quite drawn out, like almost silent, apart from the Bernard Herrmann score, who we should shout out, by the way. Big props to Bernard Herrmann, iconic score, obviously. What more needs to be said?
So good.
But because not just that, but like all of the music all the way through has that kind of... Because a lot of it's quite subtle, actually. Obviously, you mostly think of the score as being the scene from the music from the shower scene, which is obviously much parody.
The sharp violins and
and obviously from the opening credits has that in it as well. But a lot of it is this very subtle strings that's just kind of playing in the background as people are doing things. And I think one of the most effective uses of that is when Norman is, cleaning up the murder scene, disposing of the car, watching it sink slowly into the lake. That whole scene is pretty chilling, actually, even by modern standards.
Yeah, I think it's arguably more chilling than the shower scene, because the shower scene is like a very short, sharp shock of violence, but then it's the aftermath. And again, you don't get that in a lot of these other movies as well. Like, you don't linger on the after effects of the violence. It's always the spectacle of the blood and gore, but then the reality of it is very rarely ever touched on.
What makes it more chilling, I think, is that you see that Norman is troubled by it.
Yes.
Which is something you don't get in these... kind of with the best one in the world, slightly trashier slasher movies that happen later. I mean, even in something that I consider like to be a great movie, Halloween, the whole thing with Michael Myers is he's like a remorseless killer.
Yeah,
that's
he's a force of evil.
Right? Yeah, he has the black eyes, the devil's eyes.
Yeah,
but Norman does not, and that's something that I find quite disquieting about this whole film, is that he's a very human psycho, if you know what I mean. Like, he's got this very he's got this quality about him. He's troubled by what we later find out, obviously, he has done, or his disturbed personality that he's created has done. he almost seems appalled by. Well, he is appalled by.
Yeah,
the
exactly.
violence.
I was touching on that earlier, and this is something as well. Like compared to the other slasher movies and such, have you seen any of the sequels to Psycho? Obviously, I know we're not getting into those now.
I think I saw Psycho 2 about 15 years ago.
Yeah,
so I can't
Psycho
really
2
remember.
has thankfully had a bit more of a reappraisal in recent years. It's a really quite solid film in my opinion. But what's so interesting again about Norman Bates is that when you go into Psycho 2 and 3, the Psycho 4, we don't really talk about that one as much. But you know, they explore Norman as a character more. Like Norman is still like the protagonist of those movies, and they really kind of get into the meat of him being haunted by Mother and him becoming aware of the fact that he's, you know, mentally ill and stuff. And again, you don't get that because in all these other slasher movies, it's just, oh, the killer's back. Let's watch him chop up a few more people. I mean, Freddy Krueger gets a little bit of development. Chucky gets a bit of development. But they kind of go into more campy, fantastical, weird routes. Norman Bates is always very much rooted in realism. Realism. I mean, the way that they describe his mental affliction at the end of this movie
we'll
is...
Get to that. We'll get to that.
Not exactly
very
textbook.
It's very 1960, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the scene that I want to shout out, obviously it's an iconic scene in its own right, is the kind of dinner conversation between Marion and Norman, obviously in the room with all the taxidermied birds.
It's just unsettling to begin with.
Yeah, I was saying that, I was watching that last night with my mate, and I was saying, like, this is the point where you bail out of a window, surely.
Yeah. Like, why would you stay here? Like, you'd go to that diner down the road, wouldn't you?
But I think that's the thing is, Marion almost has this reaction to him where, which is what the audience has as well, where you are sympathetic. You're kind of drawn in by this kind of boyish quality he has. And he is sympathetic. And, you know, you hear about his quote-unquote invalid mother. And then you see these kind of cracks starting to form a little bit when she says, oh, why don't you, put her someplace? And he has that great speech about, oh, you mean a nut house, my mother, in one of those places? And he's talking about, and this is obviously our first sort of real inkling that he's properly disturbed, is when he's raving about, the madhouse and the kind of, the laughter and the crying and the blah, blah, blah and all that. Like, I mean, it's incredibly written dialogue as well. That's the other thing.
Absolutely.
But Perkins delivers it with this, like, because before this point, we've seen Norman, he's kind of meek. He's clearly attracted to Marion and, not really knowing how to talk to a human woman. And, that makes us sympathetic towards him because we feel that he is, somewhat, he's kind of, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's hapless, but he's also quite charming. He's making jokes and all this kind of stuff. And it's then when she suggests, as soon as they start talking about the mother and she starts poking at him about, like, well, you must want to get out sometimes. You hang out with friends and all this kind of stuff. As soon as she starts whittling away a little bit and seeing the cracks beneath the cracks within the veneer kind of thing, that's when he starts lashing out a little bit verbally. And it's beautifully handled by both actors, I must say. Like, there is a real power play between them because, as you say, Marion keeps it very controlled. She tries to, as soon as she realizes she's pushing him too hard, she tries to push her back from it. But he's in it. I think it's wonderful stuff, and that's kind of like, that's something you don't get with a character like Michael Myers as much as I love Halloween. You can never. The whole thing with Michael Myers is the horror is you can never understand him.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas the thing with Norman that I think makes him linger even after so long, right, is that he has this. He's very human.
Yeah,
he could be anyone.
Absolutely.
And and that is almost scarier than this like diabolical creature coming after you.
I mean, the one line of dialogue that I find weirdly chilling that he has, and it's almost like a throwaway line, but it really stuck with me when I watched it last night, where she asks him about the taxidermy, and his response is, "Oh, it's one of the cheapest hobbies you could have," and I just find that really quite unsettling. It's like, all the hobbies you could have, you pick taxidermy because it's cheap.
Yeah, and he kind of says as well that he only does it on birds because they're so placid, right?
Yeah.
Whereas he thinks beasts look ugly when they're stuffed.
Yeah, which is again, like, I mean, if somebody said that to me in a room full of taxidermied birds, I'd be like, this man is going to kill me and stuff me and put me on his sofa. Like, this is absolutely what's happening to me. And I think it's...
And obviously, we have a little bit of symbolism, obviously, Marion Crane.
Yes.
Wink.
The birds.
Yes. Yeah, so we have this thing of, like, she's kind of, and she's quite bird-like in a way, in her kind of reserve and her kind of flitting from situation to situation. And then, of course, she ends up in the bird cage, so to speak.
She does. And then in the swamp.
I think what I do also want to highlight about that dialogue scene is like, there is that bit where he has the famous quote of "We all go a little mad sometimes." Speaking of his mother, of course, saying he puts up with her abuse because he knows she's a frail, sick old woman, right? And he says like, "We'll go mad, a little mad sometimes. We'll have our moments. Haven't you ever done anything that you regret?" Sort of thing. And obviously, Marion's thinking about the money, and there's this almost kind of. It is quite a touching scene between them where he kind of brings that out of her and she kind of is like, yeah, I guess he's right. We'll have our moments. I should go back and make amends. And obviously that never happens because of
she gets killed.
Mother's intervention. Yes.
But no, I mean, it's like we were discussing ago, like Norman is the first man in the movie who is actually, not a scumbag to her. Or is not sort of leading her on. He's actually having a genuine conversation and seems interested in what she has to say. Until he knifes her. I like Norman a lot. And again, I really like him in the sequels as well. I think the sequels do right by him as well, which I think, again, a lot of other slasher movie villains, the sequels do them wrong. Particularly things like Freddy Krueger, who starts off very menacing and can, for the first couple of movies, he remains menacing, and then he just becomes a wisecracking joke machine.
Gets camp later on.
So camp. He becomes the Wicked Witch of the West in one of those fucking movies, and it's so ridiculous and so unnecessary and so betraying of the character. But I'd say across the 4 Psycho movies, there's never really a point where they do him dirty.
I think one thing that also kind of makes Norman compelling. Both compared to those kind of 80s slasher movies, 80s and 90s, I guess, slasher movies that we've referenced, but also against the likes of, say, Hannibal Lecter, is, when you look at Hannibal Lecter, he's this kind of he's almost all powerful, right? He can do anything. He's got this incredible mind. He can escape any situation. He can manipulate anyone he wants. That's not really true of Norman, is it? Because as this movie goes on and we have the private detective comes along, he immediately sniffs out Norman's, he doesn't quite figure out what's going on, but he immediately knows this kid's hiding something and gets, shanked for his troubles. I mean, you just got to take one look in that taxidermy room and you'd fucking know, wouldn't you? And when Marion and Sam's sister turn up, Sam finds it very easy to put pressure on Norman. And he's not being very subtle about it either. It's not like Sam's a master manipulator. He's just basically being because they obviously think he knocked her off for the money. He's kind of saying you want to escape from a place like this, buy a better motel. He's not being particularly subtle about it. And Norman is not covering up well either, which is kind of, I feel that was something that was really interesting because it kind of, it's something that we just don't see in media these days. These days our kind of psycho killers are, they're like Moriarty and Sherlock, or they're Hannibal Lecter. They're these very manipulative. They can make you think whatever you want. They're these almost satanic figures.
Yeah, omnipotent, omnipresent puppeteers who could literally do anything. And I mean, that works for a character like Hannibal, particularly in the TV series. Where he is essentially just the devil incarnate.
Yeah, I mean that. It's not saying one's better than the other. It's just kind of the contrast is interesting because it also, I think, what's interesting about Psycho. A subversion that people don't often talk about is so obviously you already have the initial subversion of Janet Leigh gets bumped off 30 minutes in, and the rest of the movie is more about Norman trying to evade various figures who are coming to seek justice for the murder. What's interesting about that is it flips the dynamic of the typical Hitchcock suspense thriller on its head, where our villain is the one who's constantly having to avoid the law, constantly.
Yes. Yeah.
And we're almost, because obviously most, think of a North by Northwest or something like that. The character you're following is constantly having to evade these people who are, trailing them for the wrong reasons, or they've got themselves mixed up in a situation they shouldn't have. And that's the typical suspense thing, is you're watching an ordinary person, or a relatively ordinary person, try and, unfuck a situation they're in, right? Whereas I think what's interesting about Psycho is it's Norman who's going through that. And obviously to the 1960 audience, they don't know he's the killer. So they have this thing of, he's covering up his mother's crimes. That's why he's getting into this situation. When you watch it with the fullness of time and the fullness of knowledge, it makes a very interesting watch, especially when we're thinking about it in terms of slasher movies. Like the idea of this killer kind of being the one that we're almost asked to empathize with. Like we're almost kind of the tension is coming from like, is he going to be found out?
Yeah, and obviously we're kind of kept in suspense throughout this movie. I mean, obviously we're not, because we know what happens, but the idea is that we're kept in suspense waiting to see Mother as well, because we know, we're led to believe that Mother is the killer. So we're waiting for that moment where we find out. And again, we have the really great subversion at the end where you see her corpse in the basement, which is again brilliant. One thing I will say about Norman though, as a killer, is like compared to a lot of the other like sort of big movie psychopaths and serial killers who are like very powerful when it comes to their murders, Norman's very like subdued in a way, and like he attacks people when they're at the most vulnerable, or he surprises them. Like when he kills Arbogast, it's just like Arbogast is coming up the stairs and he just comes out and attacks him. Like it's not like he doesn't stalk his prey as much. He just very much waits for his moment and takes it when he can get it. And again, I think that's something else as well, where like there's something a lot more human about that. It's not like Michael Myers who can lift somebody up and impale them with a butcher knife, or Jason who can literally rip somebody's head off with his bare hands. So this is just like a very human, very down to earth kind of killer. And again, that's also ultimately quite terrifying as well.
Yeah. I will say he has pretty advanced impressionist skills, because he manages to convince several people that he's talking to his mother.
That's one thing I want to flag up in this movie, and I get it's like a filmmaking thing, but how the fuck is everybody able to hear those conversations so clearly from so far away? Like, Marion can full on hear them bickering.
I mean, my concern is more that Norman manages to sound like an elderly woman when he's talking to himself. I find that quite baffling, to be honest.
I feel like that might pseudo have been an influence on Black Christmas as well, where the killer in that movie talks in multiple different voices to themselves. I'd like to think so. Although, sadly, Norman Bates never gets a line as good as "Let me lick your pretty pink cunt." So,
no, they wouldn't have got that past the censors.
No, but 14 years later, Black Christmas managed it. So.
One thing we should say, so obviously, spoiler alert, klaxon. Norman's the killer, shockingly.
Who knew?
Yeah, he killed his mother and her lover long ago, and has been messing about with her corpse and her nylons ever since. Yeah, God only knows what goes on when there's not a fucking guest at the base motel, that's all I'll say.
Well, again, I want to also quickly point out at the beginning, when Marion first arrives at the Bates Motel, you see the silhouette of Mother, like, very quickly walk past the window. Which, again, is whenever Norman refers to his mother as being frail, I'm like, well, clearly Marion should have been like, well, that's not fucking true, because she's like 6 foot tall and was walking around the house. But what I love as well about that is that, Marion arrives and, honks the horn to get the attention. And then Norman comes downstairs a few minutes later. So I love the fact that Norman was walking around the house with the wig on, dressed up as his mother, heard the honks and sort of very quickly got undressed and came downstairs. Like just moments beforehand, he was just walking around the house as mother. I think that's quite a nice little touch.
As one does.
As one does. Yeah, doing the hoovering. Dress up as your dead mother. Flick yourself off watching This Morning.
Long story short, we should wrap up on Psycho. So Loomis and it feels weird saying Loomis because now I'm picturing Donald Pleasance.
As you rightly should.
Sam and Marion's sister managed to avoid being killed by Norman, but they find out his terrible secret, as you alluded to. He's got Mother in the basement and he's running around in her frock and nylon stabbing people.
As you do.
I kind of find it's interesting that the ending is kind of so anticlimactic, because there's not really a big chase or anything.
No.
Norman just bursts out on Marion's sister, and Sam just stops him.
In the nicest possible way, Norman goes down like a bitch. Like, he just kind of gets grabbed and just sort of screams on the floor a little bit. Yeah, it is very anticlimactic.
And then we literally just cut to the police station, and Norman's under arrest, under evaluation by the psychiatrist. Who we should definitely, before we wrap up, we should talk about this fucking psychiatrist, right? Does he operate from a park bench? Because some of the conclusions that he's making are fucking wild, right? Because, he's the one who reveals, and this is the scene that Roger Ebert claimed stops this movie from being truly perfect, is the scene where the psychiatrist, for a good 5 or 6 minutes, just monologues about Norman's psychological state, right? Trying to, explain the movie. Because at this point,
Yeah.
obviously, we know that he's killed the mother and the lover long ago, and it was out of jealousy. According to the psychiatrist, Norman is a split personality between himself and his mental projection of his own mother, which may or may not be an accurate reflection of his mother. I've not seen Bates Motel.
No.
But
I mean,
but
is
certainly-
Bates Motel canon, technically? Like,
I don't care. So the whole thing is like he says, he dresses up as his mother, and he's like the Norman side of his personality has basically been eroded by the mother side of his personality, and the mother takes over whenever whenever it wants, basically. And he kind of blames Marion's death on the fact that Norman was attracted to her, and the mother got jealous and bumped her off for that reason. But what I will say is this: the psychiatrist doesn't seem massively professional, but he does have a flair for the dramatic.
Yeah.
I love it when he comes in and they go, "Did Norman kill my sister?" And he goes, "Yes, and no."
it's so good.
I mean, it's terrible psychiatry, but it makes for good drama, of course. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on this fucking character? Because he's wild, right? The psychiatrist.
Yeah, it makes for good drama. I agree, but like I have to agree with Ebert on this, and it's just something that, personally speaking, as somebody who is a writer essentially, it's one of the things I absolutely hate is when you get to the end of the movie and it's just a big exposition dump. It's just really quite lazy writing, and it stings especially in this film because up until this point, it's actually a very, very well written film. And you just get this big exposition dump.
I don't think this scene is necessarily poorly written, but yeah, I kind of agree that like I wish there'd been another way to do it without this like long monologue. But then we're looking at it from the point of view of like we live at a time where the culture is a little more focused on mental health. We might be able to make deductions from more implications.
Yeah,
whereas
this
in
is
this
true.
film, they need to kind of be like, it's a split. I mean, they also feel the need to point out that Norman is not a transvestite, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that one. Because in 1960, it's a bit like, okay, are they just being like, yeah, he's a maniac, but he's not gay?
I always wondered if that was the implication there. It's just like, yeah, he kills people, but he doesn't shag men up the arse. Like, that's the thing to focus on here.
I mean, it kind of weirdly, actually, it recalls the Silence of the Lambs, right, where they take the time to be like, Buffalo Bill is not transgender, okay? He's just a maniac.
Yeah.
But in a way that is kind of perhaps a little bit, by modern standards, doesn't really hold up. So that aside, the last thing I guess we could talk about is the last scene of the movie, which is Norman alone with his little shock blanket. Or is it Norman? Because we get the monologue of Mother, which is his internal thoughts. Which is something we actually see earlier on with Marion, is that she runs through fictional conversations in her head quite a bit of like, imagining what would happen when her disappearance is discovered, when her theft is discovered, and all this kind of thing. So it's interesting that it links back to that here, where we get Norman's mother, or Norman's projection of his mother, speaking in his mind about like, oh, they know what kind of person I am, or they think they know what kind of person I am, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. And obviously it ends on the great line of the fly lands on his hand, and she goes, I'm not even going to swat this fly. They're going to see what kind of person I am. I wouldn't hurt a fly. And we cut to Perkins giving the Kubrick stare.
Kubrick stare, complete with, and it's a really lovely little detail with the superimposed dead mother face. Just it's just subtle enough that it makes that very creepy scene that little bit creepier. And I do also want to mention about this final scene as well, especially when we're looking at him, like how because we've been comparing Norman to a lot of the later slasher villains. Usually in the slasher movies, like the killer either gets away, is seemingly killed, or is like trapped or something. In this, like, Norman he's just institutionalized. Like, he just gets caught. There's no big bloody battle against him. He's not like seemingly killed. He's just caught by the police and incarcerated. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
It's almost like, again, like you say, like a little bit anticlimactic, really.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that the chilling element comes from the realization of just how disturbed he is, rather than any like big battle. Or there's no, like you say, there's no bit where he gets killed and then he disappears like Michael Myers or anything like that. it's just the chilling thing is just the implication of like how a seemingly normal person could become so, detached from normal morality, I suppose. And in that way, it's kind of it's an interesting reflection of Marion, right? Where she's a normal person who, kind of falls into immorality, let's say. And the same is kind of true of Norman as well, where it's like the circumstances kind of push him into this psychological mess that he is now, basically.
Yeah.
But in his case, obviously, it's the reflection of, we kind of said, like, Marion is almost a woman, like, adrift in a man's world, kind of abandoned by the men in her life or mistreated in some ways. Even in small ways, like, Sam ultimately is mistreating her by, she feels dismissed by him at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, he's getting what he wants from her and not having to put any effort in, really.
But then we have this reflection of Norman, who is, by all appearances, a good, clean American boy who, who was abused by his mother to the point that he became this creature that he is now, I guess. Like,
well, yeah, he's a victim of, abuse and circumstance, whereas, Marion is just, she's just got kind of down on her luck and just hasn't really got her life together and just seizes an opportunity, and it's a very immoral thing that she does, but obviously she is about to sort of come back from the brink of it, whereas Norman's completely lost to his madness, really. Like, there's no going back for him. It's impossible.
The thing that kind of struck me on this watch, speaking of looking at it through modern eyes, I think Hitchcock does a very good job of, like, the psychiatrist. As much as we're kind of taking the piss of the psychiatrist, I do think there is an element where he's supposed to be ridiculous, right? Like, he's giving you this very, like, because the lines are very overdramatic of what he's giving. Like I said, like the thing of yes and also no, and I spoke with the mother and all this kind of stuff. Like, he's hamming it up. Right? But I think he does a very good job of, like, that room where all the people, the cops and the doctors and the psychiatrists are sitting around talking about Norman in this very elevated way, and then you cut back to Norman alone and the stark reality of this person who's just completely, as you say, like, lost to madness.
I always find it weird in that scene as well. The psychiatrist, he's doing this big theatrical performance, but, like, he's telling Sam Loomis, like, it feels like he should be having this conversation with just the police. Yeah. I don't think what's her name? Lila, is that her name?
Lila,
the sister.
Yeah.
Lila, yeah. Like, Lila and Sam should not really be in that room, I don't think.
No, absolutely not.
Like, there's some ethical nightmares there.
And it ties back to Norman's speech about the madhouse earlier on, right, where he talks about not just the insanity of the inmates, but the cruelty of the doctors looking in at them and, like, scrutinizing them.
Yeah.
And you almost get this, it's a classic Hitchcock thing as well of, like, almost turning it around on the audience and kind of being like, well, what have you been doing this entire time? You've been scrutinizing this character. You've been, coldly regarding his every move and wondering whether he's going to get caught, maybe wanting him to get caught, maybe not. But either way, at the end of the day, you're just like the rest of these people in this room. You're just coldly observing this person who could have been helped, who didn't have to be what he is now. And whereas, like, as slasher movies sort of go down the line, it's kind of become the opposite of that, where, the character that people go to see slasher movies for is the killer. We root for the killer. We don't root for, any of the survivors, really. Which I always find is one of those sort of interesting things about, like, and a lot of those movies do try and turn that back on the audience by kind of trying to judge them for what they're watching and try to, like, make you feel bad for what you're doing. But ultimately, like in the case of Psycho, the most interesting character is the one who's stabbing everybody. Yeah, but I think this movie also, it has empathy for the victims as well, because obviously Marion is a sympathetic character, but also our detective. What's his name again?
Arbogast. Which is a great name.
Arbogast is a fantastic name. I mean, we see that he's a very competent detective, but also we see that he's ultimately, because when we first introduced him, he's quite antagonistic towards Sam because he suspects that Sam's either in on it or he did something, right? But the minute that he gets another clue that sends him the other way, he's immediately like, "Oh, well, it's clear his name. He's a good guy. He's not messed up. He's not mixed up in all this." And he sounds glad to come to that realization. And I think that's something that's really interesting, like the way that character kind of turns as you're watching him. Because he kind of, when you start off, you're like, oh, he's this blowhard private detective. He thinks the worst about everyone. But actually, he has these noble qualities where, as well, he can't just leave the Bates Motel alone. As soon as he's kind of suspecting, he's like, actually, I need to dig around a little deeper. And ultimately, that's what gets him killed.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it's an interesting thing where, like, I guess Arbogast and Marion both have these redemptive moments that kind of end up getting them killed. So I'm not entirely sure what that is saying necessarily, or if it's saying anything, or if it's just kind of like, too little too late sort of situation.
Well, I mean, over the years, people have dug deep on this movie. There's the whole theory that the Bates house is representative of Norman's psyche, and like the different rooms of the house represent the id and the ego and all this kind of stuff, which I've always found interesting, but I've never fully ascribed to myself. I think it's an interesting way of reading it. I don't think it's as intentional as what some people say. But obviously, with this being a psychological horror movie, there's definitely room for that kind of interpretation. Absolutely. I think we've probably talked through all the things that we need to talk through on this one, really.
Yeah, so let's get to Kino or Inferno.
It's kind of a no-brainer, really. It's Kino, isn't it? How could it not be?
Yeah, I mean, we weren't going to Inferno fucking Psycho, were we?
No, what do you expect from us? Like, we know the filthy sluts are listening, and I know they like us to be spicy.
They want drama. Yeah.
They want drama. They want us to be controversial, but we're not going to do it because it's Psycho, and Psycho is brilliant, and you should definitely watch it. If you haven't watched it, why the fuck have you been listening to us for the last hour?
Yeah, I mean, if you're an aspiring filmmaker, I think Psycho is a must, really. Like,
oh, for sure.
It's such a masterclass in just kind of tension and just constantly building tension. And I think the thing about it being an anticlimax that we've kind of said, and we've had a few critical points here and there. I think the anticlimax actually means that the tension doesn't break in some ways.
No, yeah, I agree.
I think if there'd been this big fight or this big shootout or this big whatever, eventually that would come to its climax and that'd be that. I think what's interesting about that ending that we've spoken about, especially when you get that scene of Norman, just clearly just sitting still with his shock blanket, completely consumed by the mother personality. Like, there's no resolution for this guy. This is just this is just what he is. It's that
lingering fear, isn't it? It's knowing that he's completely lost, and there's no way he can redeem himself, because up until the reveal, and even though we obviously know it's Norman, but like, imagine, I'm trying to view this from like the audience of the 60s perspective. Like, it's easy to sympathize with Norman, and imagine it must have been fairly surprising to learn that he was the one killing people, because up until this point seems like a stand-up guy. He's a bit of a weirdo. And I definitely wouldn't.
Well, I don't know about a stand-up guy. He did.
Well, you know what I mean.
He did clear up his mother's murders.
True, but I think he's got good values at least. Not kidding.
He's not a fucking snitch. That's the main thing.
Yeah, I think he like we've said, he's very much a sympathetic character, and I think that subversion that he was actually the one like you say, dressing up in his mother's nylons and possibly having a shufti. I think.
Oh, definitely having a shufti.
He was definitely wanking in his mum's pants, wasn't he?
Yeah. All her clothes just reek of jankum.
The Bates house just stinks of cum.
It's a wank prison if ever I saw one.
So, Psycho, certified Kino.
Yeah, obviously Kino. Shall we move on to
Master Bates Motel, am I right?
Heyo! Pap.
Let's move on.
Shall we move on to film 2?
We should, otherwise we're just going to keep talking about cum.
Yes, then maybe we should stop talking about cum, bearing in mind the subject matter of the next film. Let's hear a clip!
She was too beautiful to play with boys and too young to play with men. So Alice began to play with death.
She's made repeated requests that the kid see a psychiatrist.
She has a knack of making things look like accidents.
Set against the most Catholic backdrop ever put to film, Alice, Sweet Alice is a psychological stalk and slash film that follows the questionable exploits of Alice, a 12-year-old girl who becomes the prime suspect when her younger sister Karen is murdered on the day of her first communion. Her mother is quick to jump to her aid, but everyone else around her isn't so sure.
Good summary there, Mark.
Thank you. Very brief one. I mean, I feel kind of bad about my summary now because your summary of Psycho was very detailed. I gave you 4 lines. I gave you 2 measly poots of cum, whereas you shot all the beans.
Well, you know what they say about podcast summaries, right? Like, it reflects how the speaker makes love. You're to the point, but
I am short, sharp, and to the point.
Whereas I like to take my time.
We ain't got time in the modern era for this slow lovemaking nonsense. Get in, get out, get done.
You know me, I'm old school. I'm like Barry White. Mate. I know you're on Grindr getting a quick cum deposit, but I'm out there pleasing your home.
Wow. Just awful.
On that bombshell, shall we discuss this movie about child murder and abuse?
We should. So this film is about Catholicism, if you couldn't tell, due to the themes. Getting spicy already. So this is Alice, Sweet Alice, also known as Communion, also known as Holy Terror, which are two interesting titles. I do like Communion as a title, actually. I actually do, but I think Alice, Sweet Alice definitely fits that slasher vibe a little bit better. So this movie was made in 1974, written and directed by Alfred Soule. It's kind of the only really notable thing of his career from what I'm aware of. I know that the film he did before this was Porn, I believe.
Okay.
Which would go some lengths to explaining some of this film's content. As you listeners are aware, we did put a little content warning at the start of this episode because it's, the kind of thing that should be done. Because this film talks about some pretty heavy shit and has some very untoward
There's some
content.
rum stuff in this movie.
There is. So in typical Kino Inferno fashion, Aidan had never seen this film before. I'd seen it a few times. So I'm going to immediately just sort of pass it over to him because I want to know your thoughts on this. Because you gave me a little bit off camera. You gave me an indication of what you thought of this film, but you didn't give me the goods. I've been in suspense for the last day or so. And I'm curious to know what you thought of it.
See, I handle this in the same way I make love. I like to take my time. I had never seen this film before. I'd heard of it because, I know you'd recommended it before. But also various, horror sites and stuff. It's got a real underground following this. And if you're into your horror, this is a movie that will eventually come up, especially if you're into your older horror, right? When you recommended this for the Proto-Slashers episode, I was certainly intrigued to watch it. I will say my thoughts on the movie are a little... that's what I'll say. I'm not entirely sure that I love or hate this movie. It's certainly going to be interesting to discuss. I mean, if you wanted me to give my first blush of this, it's very slow, and there are certainly points where I lost a little bit of interest. That said, there are many scenes of deplorable shit happening, and if that's the kind of thing that holds your interest, then there is plenty of that peppered throughout. I think this is probably a more interesting film to talk about than it is to watch. I think is kind of my initial thoughts, but again, I've only seen this for the first time last night.
It's interesting to me that you're not entirely sure what to make of this one, because I felt like there might have been certain stuff in this film that you might have latched onto a little bit more. Especially the whole sort of just dripping in Catholicism stuff. I was curious to know what you'd make of that.
Well, I love me some Catholicism, but it's I think this thing about this movie is I get you're right. It is there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of imagery around Catholicism. We cut to several crucifixes and images of Jesus at various points, and obviously the whole thing revolves around communion and stuff like that. I'm just not sure it has all that much to really say about the imagery that it's using. It kind of just seems to be kind of going, this is my take anyway, having only seen it for the first time. Maybe on a repeat viewing I might be able to dig into it a bit more, but certainly on the first blush, I kind of felt like it's not really saying anything all that meaningful about Catholicism, apart from like, hey, Catholic stuff's kind of creepy, right? And
bit culty.
Yeah, it's like, sure, you could do that with pretty much any religion, though. I'm not sure it has
Yeah,
all that much to say about the faith that it's basing the movie around, I guess. Which, if you compare it to something like The Exorcist, which I think, just kind of a similar time, I guess, to The Exorcist.
Yeah, same year, maybe.
Whereas I think that is a movie that is actually, it's not just using Catholic imagery, although there's Jesuits and stuff in that, it gets confusing. But they are, they're actually talking about like what it means to have faith and like the dark side of faith versus, the more positive aspects. Whereas I think this movie just kind of wants to be like, hey, Catholic stuff's kind of creepy, right? And, that's fine. Like, I'm not necessarily suggesting that makes a movie bad. It's just, I don't know that it has anything particularly original or that deep to say about it, really.
No, I think I'm with you on that. I don't think this movie's trying to make any kind of points about Catholicism. It's definitely attacking it, and Alfred Soul clearly has an issue with Catholicism because, especially when you look at the murder scenes in this movie, especially the first scene in which young Karen is strangled and then put inside an ottoman and burnt alive, which is a hell of a way to start a fucking film.
Yeah, so we should say Karen played by the only actor I recognised in this movie, which is Brooke Shields.
Yes. And after Brooke Shields became a big success, this movie had a couple of re-releases where they were sort of really, tacking on the fact that she was in this, even though she's only in it for about 15 minutes before she gets very
and I'll say I rented this movie from Mr. Jeff Bezos, and the trailer that plays, if you watch the trailer, literally one of the lines that the voiceover says is Brooke Shields, as you've never seen her before, which led me to believe that Brooke Shields would be Alice, right? Would be the lead character. But that is not the case. She is knocked off within the first 10 minutes.
I mean, it is Brooke Shields as we've never seen her before, burnt alive in a coffin.
Yeah, it's kind of, in a way, it kind of had a Janet Leigh effect on me watching this one, because I was like, oh, right, fuck, I guess she's just not in this movie. But that we should. You know what, mate? I think you should take us through the plot because you've seen this a few times.
I have, yes.
And to me, definitely there were a few points in this movie where I was like, "Sorry, who is this again? Like, what's their relationship? Like, what's going on here?" Like that, it took a little while for me to fully. Hopefully, as I texted you as I was watching it, helpfully, anyone who is. Any sisters who appear in this movie have the same hairstyle, so that you can piece together pretty quickly.
That's very true. Yeah, essentially, the protagonists of this movie, you've got young Alice, who's played by Paula Shepherd, who is supposed to be 12 years old. Paula Shepherd was 18 when they made this movie.
Was she? That's interesting.
She was 18. She turned 19 during the production, actually. And there is definitely, in the Blu-ray, you can tell a lot more because they've cleaned up the picture somewhat. And there's definitely like shots where you can see like the bags under her eyes, kind of thing. You're like, oh, that's someone who's not been sleeping much. That's somebody who might have actually started drinking and smoking pot.
Right. Sure.
And due to the content in this movie as well, like you can understand why they chose an 18-year-old
It's the responsible thing to do. I will say. I watched this in standard definition because Bezos didn't fork out for the Blu-ray, but I couldn't tell from looking at her that she was 18, but definitely her speaking voice. I was like, have they dubbed this girl in with an older actress?
Yeah, no, she was 18 when they did it. She was apparently she was a college student at the time of the production.
Right.
And again, like I say, it's the responsible thing to do given some of the very disturbing things that happen in this movie with that character.
Yeah, because I will say there's a scene, we'll get to it later on, but there's a scene where she narrowly avoids a molesting. And I was kind of like, Jesus fucking Christ, I hope that what... Because, 70s...
They were a lawless wasteland. This was the same year that we had... Reagan masturbating with a crucifix. Was it the same year? Was Exorcist 74?
Possibly. Maybe later.
Let's find out, because as we always say, we never do any research.
Also, without meaning...
73, it was the year previous.
Without meaning to be too grim, this movie stars Brooke Shields, someone who definitely got Hollywooded. Let's just say that.
Yes.
At a young age. Yeah.
Indeed.
So,
Indeed.
There was a part of me watching some of these scenes with Alice where I was like, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, knowing that she was, at least of age when she was doing this stuff it makes my butthole unclench a little bit. Just a bit like, at least she's old enough to understand what she's doing,
Yeah, no, I agree. It is the responsible thing to do, and I'm glad that Alfred Soul did do that and managed to cast an actress who you could believe was, I mean, I don't know if 12 years old. I don't know if I believe that she's 12. But
just the way they have her made up, she looks about like 14, 15, believably.
Yeah, she looks the part, which is handy. So Alice, who is supposed to be 12 years old, is, for lack of a better word, she's a little cunt. That's how I would describe her.
Yes.
She delights in pranking people. She has a thing about putting on scary masks to not only scare her sister, but scare other people. She likes to steal her sister's dolls so she can rip them apart because she's just a little cunt.
Yeah, and obviously, that's the kind of early signs that this character is troubled. And, maybe has had some
and
bad
so
things happen to her.
we basically, at the start of the movie, we see Alice torturing young Karen because that's just one of her favourite things to do. And Karen's first communion is coming up, which is a big event in the family. It's also worth pointing out as well that other than Alice, the other protagonist is Catherine, who's played by Linda Miller. She's Alice and Karen's mother. And she is divorced. And it's also then spoken about later in the movie that her and her ex-husband, they had Alice out of wedlock.
Yes.
So obviously that's very, that's a big old no-no in the Catholic world. You shouldn't be doing that. And so the dad is not really in the picture. So Catherine's a single mother with two daughters.
Harlot.
And obviously,
Harlot.
She's a harlot. She's a Marion Crane. She's a KFB.
Yeah.
She's very much living a life that is not acceptable to those around her, but she still has the support of her other family members. Her sister Annie, who is that actress, makes some choices. We'll get into.
You want to talk about a total cunt? Annie's a total cunt.
I think she means well, but she's a total cunt. A lot of people in this movie are total cunts, to be fair. But so Karen's first communion is coming up, and so essentially what happens here is they're very close with Father Tom, who is local priest. He gives Karen a crucifix to celebrate her first communion. This ticks Alice off, and Alice goes and does her usual cunty little shit.
Can we stop calling a 12-year-old girl a cunt, please?
Well, if she wasn't...
I just feel like maybe that's a line we've crossed there. Twat, maybe. Twat is fine.
So on the first day of communion, Karen is attacked by somebody in a yellow raincoat and a very creepy translucent mask who strangles her, puts her in an ottoman, and just burns her alive. And Alice is seen leaving the room after this event has supposedly happened. So everybody, knowing what Alice is like, suspects that she has committed the murder. And, you can kind of see why. And then from there, you have everybody starting to suspect Alice. And you start to see a little bit more of her sort of devious ways, in the sense that in the apartment building that they live in, she has all these knickknacks and things that she's stolen. You can see how she likes to taunt their landlord Alfonso, who we definitely
hang on. We'll put a pin in that because there's some stuff going on there. Yeah, certainly Alice kind of craves attention and gets it by any means that she can. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, because obviously, there's a degree of emotional neglect that's happening in her life, and
a degree or two. Yeah, sure. Yeah, just a smidge of the old neglect. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of that kind of stuff happening. So Alice is clearly very troubled, and people start to suspect that she's done the murder. Alfonso, for example, is very much you definitely killed your sister. He full on suspects her, and. Her auntie Annie, who, oh my god, I'm transfixed by this woman's performance in this film. It's wild. It's the aunt from Sleepaway Camp levels.
Yeah, it's kind of it's bad acting taken to such a degree that it kind of becomes incredible acting. As in, it's literally not credible.
Yeah, all of the acting in this movie is really overdone. I think,
yes.
the way that this movie portrays Catholics is that everybody is just overly hysterical about literally everything.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. But yeah, certainly there's there's some choice performances. But we should also say that one of the key elements of why Alice becomes a suspect is that she was jealous of the other sister. What's the younger sister called?
Karen.
She was quite jealous of Karen and was acting up around the communion in general because it's implied anyway because Karen was getting more attention than her, right? I think that's part of it.
Yeah, she even like steals Karen's veil, and after Karen's murder, Alice herself steps out to receive communion. So a lot of people start to suspect her again, particularly her aunt Annie, who moves in with Catherine and Alice to try and help support her after Karen's death. Not that many people seem that cut up about Karen's death. I'm just throwing that out there. Everyone kind of moves past it quite well, considering how gruesome it is.
Well, their mum has a couple of hours of looking a bit sad.
So Aunt Annie gets attacked by the person in the raincoat and the translucent mask. She gets stabbed several times in the legs on the staircase in what's a really harrowing scene.
Oh, we should say as well, have we mentioned Father Tom and that set of characters?
Yes, so I'll sort of breathe into that as well. So Father Tom is the sort of local priest. He lives in a house where there's Mrs. Tredoni, who is the housekeeper. She looks after him, and she also is looking after the Monsignor,
yes,
I believe.
Yes, an older priest.
Yeah, who's wheelchair bound, and it's implied he's possibly got dementia, and he can't even feed himself. So Mrs. Tredoni looks after Father Tom and looks after the Monsignor.
Oh, and we should say Mrs. Tredoni is definitely Italian. Definitely.
Yes. Aggressively Italian.
I don't think the actress is Italian because her accent is like, "Hey, you come to me,
It's borderline offensive, just like that.
like what I'm doing there, listeners, is actually a little understated versus what's in the movie. Hey, why you know eat your food, Monsignore, you fucking twat cunt, hey, you little bitch, eh? Also, can we just address as well, Mrs. Tredoni has a fucking wide on for Father Tom.
Oh yeah, she's like so horny for him.
In that confessional scene later on, where he's been like, "You're a good person," she's like, "I am so wet for you."
Like she's definitely having a little fiddle whilst he's saying that she's a
she's
good
like
person.
writhing around in the confessional booth, like It's crazy.
This is a really lurid movie. I think like if you haven't got that impression from us talking about it, this is a lurid film.
Oh, this is an absolute trash fest, mate. It's a trash fest.
It's really interesting to me as well because like whenever this movie gets brought up in discussions, like scholars and critics are always like, especially the ones that like it, are very much like it's a very sort of sophisticated kind of film. Like, is it fuck?
No, sophisticated is not the word I would use for this movie.
This film is grotty as fuck,
and it's not even filmed in a particularly sophisticated way. Like that's the thing. I mean, this was considered a video nasty in this country, and I think I broadly agree, to be honest.
It is an unpleasant watch, but
Scuzzy,
honestly, that's
I'd
one of
say.
the
Scuzzy.
And again, I think that's one of the reasons I quite like it because it's for its time as well. Like similar to how we were talking about Psycho, like this was pushing it for 74. Like this film has got some questionable shit in it.
Deeply. Just finish off the plot and we'll kind of get into
So essentially, Annie is attacked by the killer in the mask, and in the hospital, in one of the most overacted scenes in all of history, claims that Alice is the one that's done it. So Alice gets sent to a psychiatric institution for evaluation. And then after that, Alice's estranged father comes back and he starts to like look into what might be happening. Before long, he receives a phone call, which he believes is from his niece, who is Annie's daughter, who is sort of a character, but not really. Like, they try to sort of palm off that she could be responsible for the murders, but that doesn't really go anywhere.
Yeah.
But anyway, their dad, whose name is Dominic, I believe. I just need to double check that.
Dom, I think they say, yeah.
Yeah, Dominic, yeah. So he receives a phone call, supposedly from his niece, saying that he needs to come and meet her because she's got something to tell him. He goes to meet... I want
to flag up this scene real quick and just say that although Dom is an uncle, he is not meeting the criteria for the League of Uncles, I'm afraid.
No, he doesn't do anything nearly heroic enough because he accepts that phone call, goes to, where he's told to meet, sees the killer is there, because this killer has a very distinctive look. is then killed by said killer, and it's in this scene where the killer is unmasked, and we find out that obviously it's not Alice, because, not only is she a 12-year-old girl, and this killer is clearly, more than 4'5" and capable of murder.
That's one of the elements of this film that's the most bullshit. Is they keep suspecting these like little girls of being murderous, but it's like clearly like a fully grown woman. A good couple of heads taller than all of the girls suspected.
Yeah, like even when because you see the killer a lot, like just walking around in daylight and stuff in the costume. So it's it's not exactly, they're not subtle. But we learn in that scene that Mrs. Tredoni, the housekeeper, is the killer, and she's her sort of reasoning is, she's very much kind of lost her faith because she lost her own daughter at one point, and she sees the Monsignor's failing health, and she sees Catherine and Alice and Karen as, this dysfunctional, dissolving family that are part of this, like, Catholic church that she's a part of, and she sees Catherine as being a whore, and she's trying to, she's trying to rectify that and trying to make it so there's sort of purity again within their community, which is, just essentially she's a religious wacko.
Yeah.
That's kind of the long and short of it, really. So Mrs. Tredoni is, we find out that she's the killer. She kills Dominic. She bashes his head in a couple of times with a rock and then chucks him out of a window.
Yes. It was a wild murder.
All of the murders in this movie are quite wild. There's scarce few of them. There's not that many, but they're pretty fucking wild. So Mrs. Tredoni then goes to visit Father Tom, which...
Writhing around in the confessional booth and going, I have just sinned, Father.
It's so good.
My pussy is so wet for you, Father.
Yeah, she has this scene of, like, confessing. Like, well, she's confessing but not confessing, because she's kind of skirting around the fact that she's murdered a bunch of people.
Yeah, she's like, I had anger in my heart. This signore, he pisses me off.
Yeah, it's saying it but not saying it. So after her confession, not confession, Mrs. Tredoni goes to Catherine's apartment in full killer regalia, may I point out. Not subtle. She is literally just standing at the doorway with the knife. Like, I don't know what her plan was here. Like, was Catherine just going to open the door? She was just going to stab her? Like, it's...
Yeah, I think that's the extent of her plan.
Yeah, like, she's not a particularly clever murderer, really. Like, again, she's kind of like Norman Bates. She just kind of spring attacks people, which is nice. So Mrs. Tredoni finds that Catherine's not there, but then bumps into Alfonso, who rightly gets stabbed up, as he should.
Yes, because one thing, we should just mention this now. One thing we glossed over about Alfonso, first of all, he's a very overweight gentleman. I say gentleman, he's not a gentleman.
No, he's a right wrong.
He's covered in piss and sweat and God knows what. And is a child molester. This is something that we kind of... We talked around earlier, but let's just fucking bring it up now. He goes to molest Alice. Alice. I was getting confused with who's there. He goes to molest Alice at one point because he's being like, you did the crime and the police are going to come. You better be nice to me, kind of thing. And she's like, rightfully so, fuck off, you creep.
Yeah, like, get away from me, you piss-soaked pervert.
But then she, but then she mentions, like, she goes, like, you won't do that to me again. So it's, like, implied that, this has been going on for some time. I mean, I don't really know what the dynamic with Alfonso is supposed to be. He's like the landlord of the building they live in, right?
He is, yeah. And you kind of get the implication that he's been good to Catherine in the sense of, like, letting her live in that house. I feel like that's not explored in as much detail as it should be.
Yeah, because he has a very weird dynamic with that. I mean, weird is putting it mildly, right? I mean, he's a child molester,
he's definitely either molested her previously or has been incredibly inappropriate to her previously.
Yeah, because we also see early on that he, like, tries to boss her around and shit. Like, he's like, I'll go to the shops for me and stuff.
Yeah, and it's very peculiar. I know he has, like, 10 cats or something.
That's too many cats.
It's too many cats. Like, I have 2 cats, and that's the
2 cats is safe, but 10 cats, nones.
And it's also worth pointing out that because the version of the movie that I've always seen is the uncut version, and in the uncut version, that's where you see Alice, when Alfonso tries to get upon her, she grabs one of his kittens and she breaks its neck.
Yeah, that's in the version I watched as well.
Yeah, it's a very shocking moment.
Yeah, it's pretty fucking crazy.
Yeah, and it's the effects are pretty good. Like, it looks like a genuine cat that she kills. Which
it's that. So that's a scene, just for anyone keeping score, where our young, I guess, protagonist almost gets molested and then instead murders a cat in front of a potential molester's face. So that kind of tells you about this movie's fucking vibe, I guess. Scuzzy is the word.
It's real grotty, isn't it? Like, it's such grot. But essentially, to round off the plot, because we've sort of gone all over the map on this movie, which is to be expected, I feel like the Psycho discussion was a lot more... what's the word? Structured.
Well, that's a real movie, man. That's the thing. Whereas
this is a real movie, okay? Did you not just listen back to what you said about this film? The scene you just described. No, I'm kidding.
It's a series of grotty incidents barely strung together by a plot, this film.
I mean, isn't that just any film that we've ever written together?
Sure. Go on, you were saying the summation,
Yeah, so Mrs. Stradoni, after going to Catherine's apartment to try and kill her and finding that she's not there, and killing Alfonso because Alfonso comes out on the stairs and sees her, she goes to the church, and her identity is discovered because there are police officers that have been sort of, going around the area, and they've been obviously keeping an eye on like Catherine and Alice and stuff like that. So Mr. Stradoni does get spotted by a police officer, and he obviously tells everybody else that it's Mr. Stradoni that's the killer. So they have to think about how they can trap her, and they know that she'll go to church because, like, that's just she will. She has to go to church because she's devout.
I love her, Jesus.
Father Tom hatches his plan saying, like, get her to come to the church, and we'll start to give out communion, and like she will come to me, and I will, that's when I can sort of bring her to you, is during communion, which is a hell of a plan.
Yeah, I don't see any police force in the world agreeing to this, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's some bullshit. They'd just be like, we could just kick down the door, right? Like, we don't have to have this elaborate setup. We're the police.
And so Mrs. Stradoni goes to church, as they expected, and when they start giving out the
communion... I must take a communion from Father Tom. It is like I am tasting his penis.
It's pretty much that, yeah. It's amazing that she's trying to wipe out all the sinners in the community, but she's just frothing for Father Tom. Like, she wants to do some sinning herself. I think that's why she's knocking people off. She reckons she can probably score some tallies, and then she can have a bit of a ride on Father Tom.
I kill for God, so he will let me fuck at the priest.
I love how you were chastising me for calling a 12-year-old a cunt, but that accent you're doing is just so offensive.
What is offensive about my accent?
Anyway, the ending of this movie. So Mr. Stradoni goes to kneel down to take the communion, and Father Tom denies her it and sort of whispers in her ear, "You need to come with me, the police are here." And then Stradoni has a full-on meltdown.
Yeah, she goes mental, mate.
She's like, how, you give the communion to the whore over there, pointing at Catherine.
Mark,
Catherine being
Mark,
like, well,
you're
what
describing
the fuck
dialogue given by Stradoni and you're not doing the voice.
You don't give it to the whore.
You will give it the communion to the whore. You do not give it to me.
But like, it's screeched. Like, her dialogue is screeched.
Yeah.
It's quite the performance, as all the performances in the movie are.
And very Italian.
And so, because obviously she has this massive meltdown, Stradoni then pulls out her fucking knife and slits Father Tom's throat in the middle of the church. And as he bleeds out, she hugs him. And there's this amazing shot of just the blood pouring out over her yellow raincoat, which is just wonderful.
The blood is like the come. I wanted a jangum, but I get the blood instead.
You put the blood upon my face like a cup.
Jesus Christ.
You started this, okay? Don't be fucking coming at me, okay?
Why do we say these things?
I don't know, mate. This is the thing. Like, we will never make money off this. Like, honestly, mate, this show is like a collection of evidence.
I know. I do sometimes wonder about if we're ever going to be in a situation where we're in court and they're going to play back episodes of this show. Clearly, this matter unhinged.
Case in point. But at the very end of the movie is Stradoni slits Father Tom's throat. He bleeds out in this, and whilst the fucking church just watches, like everybody's just stood there watching this happen. And then Alice, clearly very disturbed by what's happened, picks up the bag that Stradoni carries her like mask and knife and stuff in, and she just kind of walks away from the carnage. puts the knife in the bag and then just does the almost like the very best creepy child stare into the camera.
Yeah, what is going on there? This is something that I didn't quite grasp about the ending, because is the ending trying to be like, now she is going to do some murders? Or what?
I've never interpreted it as she's going to do some murders. I think it's just kind of a way of being like, Alice is truly screwed at this point. Like, she's just so traumatized. Like, there's kind of no going back at this stage. Like, she's just, yeah. She could do some murders, she might not. But, yeah, I think it's just to be a bit like, you know, they may have created a monster well and truly.
Right, yeah. Because the thing is, well, I don't know if did we mention this, that for a section of this movie, Alice gets sectioned.
She does, yeah. I did mention that earlier.
Yeah, okay,
so
sure.
she's absent from the movie when her dad is murdered by Mrs. Stradone.
Right. And there's a lot of stuff there where you find out that Alice was hiding from her mum the fact that she was menstruating, for example.
Yes, which comes back to sort of... Yeah, there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on there.
Yeah, and that whole section of the movie is something that I wanted to flag up, because it's just like... The problem with this... I guess the problem I have with this movie, just knowing what to make of it wise, is there are moments of this that are like kind of ridiculous and lurid and kind of Giallo-esque. I mean, a lot of people say this is like an American Giallo, right?
Yeah, that's a very common critique of the movie,
you know, and there's some very like over-the-top stuff, and there's some hammy acting and some violence and stuff. But then there's this stuff in the movie where it's like, oh yeah, this little girl's getting molested by there's nothing that anyone can do about it because that's her landlord. Or it'd be like, oh look, now she's being sectioned. And all the psychiatrists are like, hey, you should let her stay here. You shouldn't try and take her. And the parents are like, no, well, fuck you. We do what we want. And it's like, it seems a little like there's two tones kind of wrestling with each other in this movie. Because I was a bit like, this is just making me very sad. Like, this is just a sad film about a little girl who's been failed by everyone around her.
I mean, I've brought this film up time and time again on the show, and I will continue to bring it up until we eventually cover it. But like, one film that I would compare this to in terms of its tone is it reminds me a lot of something like Sleepaway Camp, where the overall presentation is quite hammy and the acting is, you know, broad to say the least.
Yeah.
But the horror elements are very stark in comparison.
I would say though that Sleepaway Camp is kind of insane throughout. Like there's.
Yeah.
Like this movie, like I said, it kind of has this ebb and flow to it where the problem is you're kind of sitting in these scenes that are quite grim. And it's like, oh, I don't know about this. Whereas Sleepaway Camp, it has some grim shit in it, but it's like, it all cracks along at such a bizarre pace. And, you know, the dialogue is consistently ridiculous as well. So it's kind of...
I think if I had to compare it, though, that's what I would do, where, like, you know, you've got this kind of, like, weird, heightened tone to it, but then whenever the horror comes in, it's very stark and very grim and very brutal. Which, you know, again, is juxtaposed against scenes of people just playing it to the back row when they're inside pokey little apartments. Like, Annie, again, is just overacting to the nth degree. Like, her hospital scene is just... I don't even know how to describe it.
Yeah, it's deranged. I guess what I would say is, like, okay, I guess my question for you is, like, what is it about this movie that you think... Well, A, that you personally enjoy, and B, that you think is, like, why it's held up as... you know, this kind of cult favourite, this kind of this thing that you must see if you're into your slashers and your horror and everything.
I think there's a few things to talk about. I think first thing I'll obviously mention is the sort of slasher elements, because, you know, that's what we are initially here to talk about. So one, I love the design of the killer. I think the yellow raincoat and the translucent, like, makeup mask, I don't know what you call that kind of mask. It has a specific name, but I'm not sure what it is. But I think that look is incredible. It's very creepy. It's memorable. It's obviously cribbing from Don't Look Now, and Alfred Soul has said on record that he definitely lifted the whole raincoat thing from Don't Look Now. And if you are going to borrow from another horror movie, you might as well borrow from a truly brilliant one like that. So I love the design of the killer. I think whenever there is, like, the sort of scenes of violence and murder, they are really quite shocking in a way. Like, I always find the murder scenes in this movie really quite unpleasant, which I can't say of a lot of movies. Call me, you know, scuzzy or whatever, the genuinely lurid tone of the movie is always something that I find kind of appealing, just because I like lurid movies. Because there's a real sort of like perversity to this movie, I guess, and for its time as well. Like, you didn't see a lot of films like this. This is a very angry movie, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it's really angry about, though. I mean, the thing is that what I was kind of latching onto as the sort of narrative drive. I mean, I know people always talk about the Catholicism element of this movie, especially with regard to the kind of theme of like child abuse and stuff that happens and all that kind of thing. To me, though, like I say, it didn't really have anything to say about Catholicism that was all that interesting. I think what I would have preferred is if the movie was more focused on Alice and this idea of like all the people around her have kind of contributed to her, you know, becoming this like antisocial misfit, basically. Which the movie definitely does, but then also there's long stretches of this movie that are about her dad being a detective for some reason. Which,
comes out of nowhere. I think I don't know kind of where you're going with this, but like, I think the second act of the movie is the messiest.
Yeah. I think the third act is the most... I don't know. I guess the third act after the killer's revealed. Because I like the fact that the killer isn't revealed at the very end. Like, you do get a pretty much an act of the movie where, you know, some suspense kicks in and you're kind of like, oh, yeah, okay, interesting. And it seems like Tredoni's going to kill Catherine at one point. It doesn't quite happen, and you know, that kind of stuff. I think I would have also preferred it if there'd been more kind of explicit parallels drawn between Alice and Tredoni, so you get this element of like, obviously part of what's made Tredoni into a killer is this kind of heavily religious society around her. And maybe that's kind of what the ending's kind of implying as well, with Alice taking the knife. It's like, oh, it's this generational trauma that kind of goes from you know, goes throughout the years. But at the same time, it's kind of like I said, this is what I mean by like a movie that's more interesting to talk about than it is to watch. Where like, I think watching it, I was mostly thinking it'll be interesting to get Mark's opinion on this more than I was like, oh, this is really like provoking any opinion from
No, that's completely fair. I mean, this movie ticks a lot of boxes for things that I like, and I have a lot of admiration for this film. I will agree that it needs a little bit reining in terms of what it's trying to say and what it's trying to do. It's a little bit vague in what it's saying, and maybe it doesn't really have a point to make. I mean, I know that due to the films the director made previously, he had a lot of issues with like censorship from Catholic societies and such, and he grew up around a lot of this sort of stuff, so I think he has a lot of inner turmoil when it comes to this sort of thing, and I don't think he's harnessed it in a way that's really saying anything. It's just he's kind of just using it as a conduit, I guess, to tell this kind of story. And
I think it's just that thing of like, Catholic imagery is inherently a little bit creepy, I guess.
Yeah.
Which,
and it's everywhere in this film. That's the thing. Like, it's literally everywhere. It's just every frame of this film is dripping with some kind of Catholic imagery, which fair play to the production team, I'll say.
Yeah, and that's something that I did think the film captured quite well, was this idea of like, in these religious communities, it is fucking everywhere. It's not just at the church, it's in the home, it's in the hospital, it's in the schools, it's everywhere. It's not just it's not just something you do on Sunday, you know, it's like a constant background noise.
But in terms of like looking at it in the ways that it's sort of inspired like slasher movies, I think the look of the killer, like the mass killer thing is not exactly unique to this movie, but the look of the killer in this is definitely very iconic and is very recognizable to people like ourselves who are, you know, quite familiar with the genre. The level of violence and gore as well. I mean, like, again, around this time period, films were getting a bit bloodier. I mean, Hammer Horror had blood and guts in it for a while, but the violence in this movie feels a lot more, I wouldn't say real, because it's not particularly like realistic violence, but it's very brutal, I would say.
Yeah, and it kind of, I think what this movie does in that regard is like, that maybe hadn't been done quite so much before, is like, this movie kind of revels in the violence. It's not presenting it necessarily in a way that's like, because people, this is not a slasher film, but people will talk about like George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead as being kind of like a shockingly violent film for the time. But I think the difference there is like that movie presents the violence as like horrific. It's like the debasement of humanity kind of thing. Whereas this movie definitely is rubbing your face in it a bit and is kind of like, it's reveling in what it can get away with, basically.
Yeah, it's very macabre as well. Like, again, I love that shot at the end where Tredoni hugs Father Tom and just the blood just oozes all over her and down the raincoat. It just looks so great. And there's even like a little bit in the hospital where Annie, after she's been attacked by the killer, which again, like that scene is, you don't really kind of see these kinds of scenes in a lot of movies, but like the killer is just wildly stabbing at Annie through the banisters on the stairs. So it goes in her thigh, it goes in her foot. Like it's just, it's not like it's a sort of constant like chest stabbing and stuff like you see in a lot of other movies. It's just, and it looks painful. That's the other thing as well. Like I watch that scene and go, God, that would fucking hurt.
Yeah, and there's blood everywhere as well as
and Annie crawls out into the street in the rain, screaming, bleeding everywhere. It's great. It's so great. But no, so circling back to the whole slasher thing, I think I see a lot more elements in this movie of what would become more predominant in slasher movies. Like again, particularly the way it kind of flirts with certain ideas and themes, but never quite makes a commentary about them, really. You see this in a lot of slasher movies where they try and tack on some kind of like religious motive, or they sort of section off a community and talk about something like that, but they never really go that in depth on it, really.
I think something that's interesting to flag up as well that you can compare with Psycho is like, speaking of slasher movie tropes that these films both kind of help to encode, neither of these films really has the final girl, virtuous woman who survives archetype, right? Like they both kind of have flawed female characters at the center, I suppose. I mean, the closest thing you have to a final girl in this movie is Alice herself, and she's not. I mean, she's virtuous by way of being a child, of course, but like is a troubled young lady to say the least.
Yeah,
not your traditional plucky heroine. And Alice's mum is obviously. I mean, this movie almost kind of flips that dynamic before it was even born, because the killer is the puritanical one, and the victims are supposedly sinners in her eyes, right?
Yeah, the heathens. Yeah.
I think also like this film is kind of like, I would say it's kind of connective tissue between what becomes the American slasher with Halloween and everything that imitates that, Texas Chainsaw Massacre as well, that kind of thing. Is the connective tissue between that and the Italian giallo movies.
Yeah.
Because it definitely has that atmosphere of the giallo movie, and there's definitely the tropes in this movie, as someone who's seen a lot of giallo now, definitely ring true. Like, if I would have guessed this was like a dubbed Italian movie if I didn't know it was American, because there's this element of like the detective story going on, one of like the murder mystery thing. One of the elements that you always get in giallo movies is like that puritanical killer thing is actually quite a big trope in giallo movies, right? Like the idea of like,
absolutely,
I'm killing these people because the way they live is sinful. That's actually a big giallo trope.
Yeah, I don't torture a duckling immediately springs
the
to
Lucio
mind.
Fulci movie. So and also the element of like the amateur detective, in this case, the father of the victim. Although interestingly, they kill him off, which is not normally what happens in the giallo thing. The protagonist normally at least makes it to the final confrontation, even if they don't make it to the end credits.
The comparisons between like this film and giallo are particularly interesting because Alfred Soul got asked about this, and he claimed that at the time of him making the movie, he'd never seen a Dario Argento movie. He wasn't particularly familiar with Italian cinema, which, if so, fair enough, because this movie really has that energy and that vibe and that like even that presentation.
I call massive bullshit on that, just because. What the fuck are you talking about? That's like if you made a movie with a giant monster, which is a guy in a rubber suit, and went, I've never heard of Godzilla. It's like, what? You clearly did, because look at what you made. Like, I'm not, maybe he's not seen Dario Argento specifically, but like, come on now. There's definitely some influence there, just because there is. There just objectively is.
Yeah, it's very much on display.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's trying to be a giallo movie.
No.
I think it's sort of just cribbing elements of it, and it is. I think the assessment is very true. And when people say this is the closest that America has ever come to making a giallo movie.
Yeah, without it being... Well, I'd caveat that with, like, without it being a deliberate pastiche, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Like a genuine giallo movie, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that I like about it is because it has that kind of giallo energy, and if I'm really in the mood for like that kind of film, this really does scratch that itch for me. I mean, I would definitely put this in the proto-slasher camp because I don't think it fully embodies all of the sort of ideas and tropes that we would so commonly associate with the genre, but it's kind of got a lot of the skeleton of that kind of genre there. Like, you know, you've got the iconic look of the killer, the sort of memorable characters, be it, you know, just because they're memorable because they're either absolute disgusting, creepy nonsense or really, you know, wildly overacting, micromanaging ants who need to just wind their necks in.
She does need to wind her fucking neck in.
She does. And the fact that she survives, the fucking gore of Alfred's soul to let Annie survive is criminal. But you've got that element to it. You've got a loose whodunit mystery, which again, like that's another thing. Like the later slasher movies, the whodunit element is the big thing.
Yeah.
And because Psycho doesn't necessarily have that, because we're kind of immediately told, well, Mother did it. There's no real mystery in Psycho, whereas there is a mystery in Alice Sweet Alice, but like you so rightly pointed out to me, if you've seen a movie...
Yeah, the minute they introduce a housekeeper character who you don't hear from for another 30 minutes, it's kind of like, well, I mean, there's going to be her, isn't it?
Yeah, literally, you text me going, calling it now, it's her, isn't it? And I was just like, of course you'd figure that out.
Especially because when you see her, Alice is being confrontational towards her, and she's like, you're naughty child, you're silly, you get out of my way, I'm Italian.
One little aspect that I do really like is because of Alice's... love of pranking people, she puts on the yellow raincoat and the mask to scare Tredoni, and I like the fact that Tredoni uses that as her look.
Yeah.
Because she's deliberately... I was about to say she's deliberately trying to frame Alice, but I'm not entirely convinced she is.
I think I got more the sense that she's just using that as convenient cover rather than that was her plan all along.
Yeah, because it's only like the rest of the family, like Annie, who suspects it's Alice, and you kind of get this weird thing with Annie where she's constantly saying to Catherine that she loves Alice like her own and all this, and it's like, well, I don't believe that for 1 second because you're awful to her. Yeah. You're absolutely horrible to her, and you know you've got your own daughter who is clearly being neglected anyway.
Yeah, because she's like, she's just kind of. I don't know. She's just like a nothing. She just kind of drifts in and out.
But they're like, you know, that's the thing. And I find this movie fascinating and bizarre and weird and creepy enough that it always kind of holds my attention. And I always enjoy watching it. I do have to agree with you, though. There are some sort of lulls in the plot. And
I think, honestly, it's the whodunit element that kind of slows this movie down. Where if it was just the batshit psychological weird stuff... You know, if it was just showing, like, if it was just a killing spree, but also there's Alice, everyone thinks Alice did it. And the thing is, what I'm saying is, whenever it focuses on the dad, I was like, oh, for fuck's sake, can we get on with this?
But he swiftly gets
get this movie going?
Killed off.
Not swiftly enough, in my liking.
And I do quite like the scene between Dominic and Catherine where they start to sort of get it on again, and you know they're kind of looking at their marriage, and
because nothing makes you want to fuck your ex-wife more than your daughter being killed.
People don't care that Karen's dead. Nobody cares. But yeah, no, I think there's other elements of this movie that kind of filter into the whole slasher thing. I actually think the murder of Karen at the beginning feels very reminds me a lot, should I say. It's not reminiscent, but it reminds me a lot of sort of later slasher movies that always start with a really horrific crime that often involves a child dying, because you've also got things like Prom Night as a big example. Halloween, you know, a child is a murderer at the beginning of that one. It has that initial shocking first murder that kickstarts the plot and kickstarts the whodunit element. Like, that's very much there in this film. Again, that's still coming from giallo movies. I mean, immediately Deep Red springs to mind as well. Sorry, my cat is just going insane behind me.
Crazy pussy.
I mean, I don't know if there's much else to really say about this one. I think it's a very sort of... I'd go as far as say as a seminal film in the sort of creation of the slasher movie, because I think a lot of films have borrowed from this, or at least used it as a template. But also, this movie is heavily borrowing from Giallo movies.
Yeah.
So
like I said, I think it's that kind of missing link between the two a little bit.
Yeah, because this was 4 years before Halloween and 14 years after Psycho.
Yeah.
And also 74, if I'm not mistaken, was also the same year as Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Which, again, is a movie that I would never call Chainsaw Massacre a slasher movie.
No, that's just an uplifting story about a man using his legal right to protect his home in Texas. I'm serious as cancer. There's a good chance that Leatherface would have been let off for pretty much everything he does in that movie. Stand your ground, am I right? You'd love to see it. That aside...
Wow. Okay.
I'm just saying, in Texas, good chance he would have gotten away with it. They came into his property, man.
That's true. That's true. They trespassed, they fucked around, they found out.
They did fuck around and find out. Anyway, we're not talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I personally, if we're talking about slashers, I would lump that one in with the Proto-Slashers, I guess, because I think what Texas Chainsaw brings in is like the group of teenagers element, you know?
Yeah.
Again,
it's got that to it. It's also got like the really kind of recognizable, iconic killer.
Yeah.
Like Leatherface's entire look is, you know, I mean, he has a range of looks as well. Yeah, you have
he's
bloody apron,
looks,
Leatherface. Yeah, I like the suits and the makeup. I think that's a really interesting look for him. Yeah, I think there's a lot of influence on Halloween in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, particularly the majority of the end sequence where it's just Marilyn Burns being chased for a good 10 minutes straight. Which, again, Halloween kind of redid with Jamie Lee Curtis running around screaming her head off whilst Michael just slowly walks behind her.
So, on that note, Mark, shall we move into Kino or Inferno?
We should, yes.
Well, you go first. This is your choice.
I'm giving it a Kino just because I do, as you can guess, I do like this movie. I like it quite a lot. I've watched it a couple of times now, and I always have a lot of fun with it. And like I said before, it ticks a lot of my boxes for what I look for in a movie. It's it's gory and horrible, and it's just it's a grotty little time. It's deeply upsetting in places, and I've never failed to find certain elements of it to be truly disturbing. But I'll always throw praise at a movie that can consistently disturb me. It's why, I think that's why this movie is. I like it as much as I do, because every time I watch it, it does have an effect on me, and I don't get that very often.
I think I'm going to. I'm deciding my rating on the spot, on our patented binary rating system, which allows no room for nuance. I think I'm going to have to give this like a very soft Kino. Only because of its kind of status within the genre that it inhabits. I think if you ask, okay, here's something. I'm gonna break the binary rating system. I'm gonna say, in terms of like what I'm giving it as an official rating, it's going to be a soft Kino. What I'm giving it for now on first viewing as a personal rating, I'm dipping its toe into the Inferno a little bit. Not because I don't think this movie's any good or there's nothing worth watching about it. It's just I didn't find the way it was strung together to be as engaging as it could be. That said, there are some great scenes. It has a suitably scuzzy atmosphere. I just wish that fucking dad character didn't take up so much screen time, honestly. That's the main thing for me. It's like really, really dragged the movie down. But I think that's kind of my take. If you're interested in slasher movies and the history of slashers, you should definitely check this one out. That said, if that's not your bag, skip it.
Yeah, I feel like if you're not as into these kinds of movies as what we may be, it's definitely not going to be as interesting.
Whereas like Psycho or Halloween, or even Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I would recommend to like anyone to watch, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Those are great examples of the genre. They're great examples of filmmaking. You know, they've got a lot more sort of going on. I mean, like Halloween especially, like there's real craftsmanship behind that film.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's endured as well as it has. Okay,
well, that's been it for another Kino Inferno. Hope you've enjoyed it. Don't be killing people. It's the wrong thing to do. But what you can do, if you do feel the urge to murder rise, is you can relieve that tension by, checking out our various online presences. First among them, but certainly, that is not to diminish the rest of them. First among them is Spotify, where you can find us at Kino Inferno. I don't know why I start with that. Most people listen on Spotify, so they know. However, you can also find us on Facebook at Kino Inferno. You can find us at Instagram at Kino Inferno, where occasionally, that's not a word, occasionally we post thirst traps and things like that. Stitcher you can find us on, because we figured out sort of what it is. Well, we didn't figure it out, but the kangaroo did. He's got that one sorted.
Big up kangaroo.
At Kino_Inferno on Twitter. We're on YouTube. Don't know why we bother. We get like 6 views an episode on YouTube, but we're there for prosperity's sake. So with that, I've been Aiden.
And I've been Mark.
And I've been Norman Bates, and I'm masturbating in my mother's tights. Oh, mother!
Smells like cum in it.
The only way you'll lick this is one day at a time. If you can make it to midnight without calling the quarry line, you'll know you've beaten it forever.
Midnight?
Listen to your mother, Lisa. I owe everything I have to my mother's watchful eye and swift hand. Oh, there's Mother now, watching me. What's that, Mother? Well, they have a right to be here. It's school business. Mother, that sailor suit doesn't fit anymore.
I think we should go.
Uh-huh.